Chapter 15 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Prajakta. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quimby. Artificial Swarms. Principles should be understood. Artificial swarms can be made with safety at the proper season. To the beekeeper who wishes to increase his stocks, it will be an advantage to understand some of the principles. I have had some little experience that has led to different conclusions from those of some others. I have seen it stated and found the assertion repeated by nearly every writer that whenever bees were deprived of their queen, if they only possessed eggs or young larvae, they would not fail to rear another. There are numerous instances of their doing this, but it is not to be depended upon, especially when left in a hive full of combs, as the following experiments tend to prove. Some experiments. Several years since I had a few stocks well supplied with bees, and every indication of swarming present, such as clustering out, etc., but they pertinaciously adhere to the old stock through the whole swarming season. Others, apparently not as well supplied with bees, threw off swarms. I had but few stocks and was very anxious to increase the number, but these were provokingly indifferent to my wishes. Taking the assertions of these authors for facts, I reasoned thus: in all probability, there are eggs enough in each of those stocks. Why not drive out a portion of the bees with the old queen and leave about as many as if a swarm had issued? Those left will then raise a queen and continue the old stock, and I shall have 6 instead of the 3 that have been so obstinate. Accordingly, I divided each, examined, and found eggs and larvae. Of course, all must be right. Now, thought I, my stocks can be doubled at least annually. If they do not swarm, I can drive them. The result unsatisfactory. My swarms prospered. The old stocks seemed industrious, bringing in pollen in abundance, which to me at that time was conclusive that they had a queen, or soon would have. I continued to watch them with much interest, but somehow after a few weeks there did not seem to be quite as many bees. A few days later I was quite sure there was not. I examined the combs, and behold, there was not a cell containing a young bee of any age, not even an egg in any one of these old stocks. My visionary anticipations of future success speedily retrograded about this time. I had, it is true, my new swarms in condition to winter, although not quite full, but the old ones were not, and nothing was gained. I had some honey, a great deal of bee bread, and old black comb. Had I let them alone and put on boxes, I should have probably obtained 25 or 30 pounds of pure honey from each, worth 5 times as much as what I did get. Besides, the old stocks, even with the old comb, would have been better supplied with both honey and bees, altogether much better as stocks for wintering. Here was a considerable loss merely by not understanding the matter. I carefully looked the bees over and ascertained to a certainty that neither of them had a queen. I smothered what few there was left in the fall. I then knew of no better way. I had been told that the barbarous use of fire and brimstone was part of the luck, that a more benevolent system would cause the bees to run out, etc. Further experiments. Subsequent to these experiments, I thought perhaps the jarring of the hives in driving might have some effect on the bees and prevent their rearing a queen. This idea suggested the dividing hive when the division could be made quietly, but success was yet uncertain. I was told to confine the bees in the old stock 24 hours or more after driving out a swarm. This I tried with no better results. Again, I drove out the swarm, looked out the queen, and returned her to the old stock, compelling the new swarm to raise one. To be certain they did so, I constructed a small box about 4 inches square by 2 in thickness, the sides glass. In this I put the piece of brood comb containing eggs and larvae, and then put it on the hive containing the swarm, having holes for communication, a cover to keep it dark, etc. They were very sure to rear queens, but from some cause were lost after they were matured. Now, if others have been more successful in these experiments than myself, it indicates that some favorable circumstances attended them that did not me. I have not the least doubt, but the result will be favorable sometimes. Yet, from the foregoing, I became satisfied that not one of these methods could be relied upon. Instead of constructing a queen's cell and then removing the egg or larva to it from another cell, I always found that the cell containing such egg or larva was changed from the horizontal to the perpendicular. Such cells as were in the way below were cut off, probably using the material in forming one for royalty, which, when finished, contains as much material as 50 or 100 others. My experiments did not end here. I can now make artificial swarms and succeed 9 times in 10 with the first effort, and the reader can as easily do the same. It must be in the swarming season or as soon as the first regular swarm issues. You want some finished royal cells that any stock having cast a swarm will furnish, unless in rare instances where they are too far up among the combs to be seen. A successful method. When you are all ready, take a stock that can spare a swarm. If bees are on the outside, raise the hive on wedges and drive them in with a little water and disturb them gently with a stick. Now smoke and invert it, setting the empty hive over. If the two hives are of one size and have been made by a workman, there will be no chance for the bees to escape except the holes in the side. These you will stop, no matter about a sheet tied around it. With a light hammer or stick, strike the hive a few times lightly and then let it remain 5 minutes. This is very essential because most of the bees, if allowed the opportunity, will fill themselves with honey after such disturbance. All regular swarms go forth so laden. A supply is necessary when bad weather follows soon after. It is also used in forming wax, a very necessary article in a new hive. The amount of honey carried out of a stock by a good swarm, together with the weight of the bees, which is not much, will vary from 5 to 8 pounds. This allowing time for the bees to fill their sacs and supplying the old stock with a royal seal, I believe is entirely original, the importance of which the reader can judge. Advantages of this method. It is very plain that a queen from such finished cell must be ready to deposit eggs several days sooner than by any other method that we can adopt. It is also clear that if we have a dozen queens depositing eggs by the 10th of June, that our bees are increasing faster, on the whole, than if but half that number are engaged in it for a month later. There is yet another advantage. The sooner a young queen can take the place of the old one in maternal duties, the less time will be lost in breeding. The more bees there will be to defend the combs from the moth, and the surest guarantee for surplus honey. When the bees have filled their sacs, proceed to drive them into the upper hive by striking the lower one rapidly from 5 to 10 minutes. A loud humming will mark their first movement. When you think half or two-thirds are out, raise the hive and inspect progress. They are not at all disposed to sting in this stage of proceeding, even when they escape outside. If full of honey, they are seldom provoked to resentment. The only care will be not to crush too many that get between the edges of the hives. The loud buzzing is no sign of anger. If your swarm is not large enough, continue to drive till it is. When done, the new hive should be set on the stand of the old one. A few minutes will decide whether you have the queen with the swarm, as they remain quiet, otherwise uneasy, and run about when it will be necessary to drive again. If both hives are one color, set the old one 2 feet in front, but if of different colors, a little more. I prefer this position to setting the old stock on one side even when there is room, yet it can make but little difference. Should you set it on one side, let the distance be less. When the old stock is taken much farther than this rule, all the bees that have marked the location, and all the old ones will have done so, will go back to the old stand, and none but the young bees that have never left home will remain. The same will be the case with the new swarm if moved off. It will not do to depend on the old queen keeping them, as she does when they swarm out naturally. This has been my experience. Try it, reader, and be satisfied by putting either of the hives 15 or 20 feet distant. Before you turn over the old stock, look among the combs as far as possible for queen's cells. If any contain eggs or larvae, you may safely risk their rearing a queen, but otherwise wait till next morning, or at least 24 hours. Then go to a stock that has cast a swarm and obtain a finished royal cell as before directed and introduce it. You will have a queen here as soon as if it had been left in the original hive, and no risk of an after swarm because there is but one. But when there are young queens in the cells at the time of driving, after swarms may issue. Should a queen cell be introduced immediately, it is more liable to be destroyed than after waiting 24 hours, and then it is not always safe. After it has had time to hatch, which is about 8 days after being sealed, cut it out and examine it. If the lower end is open, it indicates that a perfect queen has left it and all is safe. But if it is mutilated or open at the side, it is probable that the queen was destroyed before maturity, in which case another cell will have to be given them. Artificial swarms only safe near the swarming season. By what I have said about artificial swarms, it would appear that it is unsafe at any time but the swarming season. That is my opinion. It may do a little in advance or a little after, providing royal cells can be had. By feeding as directed in Chapter 9, you may induce a stock to send out a swarm some days in advance of the regular season, thereby giving you a chance for these cells somewhat early. Sometimes hazardous. To make such swarms at any time when the bees are destroying drones would be extremely hazardous, not only on account of the young queen being impregnated, but their massacre denotes a scarcity of honey. Therefore, I would advise never to make swarms or drive out bees at such periods when it can be avoided, without spare honey is on hand to feed them. Some objections. It has been argued by some, and with much reason, that nature is the best guide, and it is better to let the bees have their own way about swarming. If honey is abundant and the stock is in condition to spare a swarm, their own instincts will teach them to construct royal cells. If it fails before they are ready and the royal brood is destroyed, it is because the existence of the swarm would be precarious and it is best not to issue. I will grant that in many instances it is better. The chance is better for surplus honey. The stock is quite sure to be in condition to winter, and some judgment is required to tell when a stock can spare a swarm. But yet, we are sometimes anxious to increase our stocks to the utmost that safety will allow, and often have some that can spare a swarm as well as not, but refuse to leave, perhaps commence preparations, and in a few days abandon them. Now, it is evident that as long as many continue such preparation, that honey is sufficiently abundant to put the safety of the swarm beyond hazard. Some stocks will swarm while these others just as good, that had abandoned it before, and have not now begun again, to be in time before a partial failure of honey, and some may not have commenced in season. Natural and artificial swarms equally prosperous. I can see no difference in artificial or natural swarms of equal size at the same time. By taking the matter in time into our own hands with the rules given, we make a sure thing of it, that is, we are sure to get the swarms, when, if left to the bees, it would be uncertain and no greater risk afterwards than with natural issues. This matter too often delayed. I am aware that this matter will be apt to be put off too long. Wait and see if they don't swarm, will be the motto of too many, and when the season is over, drive them. Perhaps a good swarm has sat outside the hive all through the best of the honey season and done nothing, while they could have half filled a hive, but this is all lost now, as well as the best chances for getting sales. Let me impress the necessity of doing it in season when it will pay. If you intend to have a swarm from every stock that can spare one, begin when nature points out the proper time, which is when the regular ones begin to issue. It must indeed be a poor season when there are none. Is the age of the queen important? There is another object affected in this way, considered by some apiarians as very important. It is the change of the queens in the old stock. A young queen is thought to be much more prolific than an old one. They even recommend keeping none over 2 or 3 years old and give directions how they may be renewed. But as I have been unable to discover any difference in relation to the age in this respect, I shall not at present take much time to discuss it. It is well enough when we can take our choice without trouble to preserve a young queen, when we consider that there are but few queens, but what will deposit 3 times as many eggs in a season as are matured, it looks as if it would hardly pay to take much trouble to change them. At what time the queen becomes barren from old age, I presume has never yet been fully determined. A friend of mine has had a stock in a large room 8 years that has never swarmed and is still prosperous. I think it very probable that this queen will gradually decay and possibly become barren some weeks before she dies. If so, this stock will soon die off. A few such cases will probably occur in swarming hives, perhaps 1 in 50, but generally such old and feeble queens are lost when they leave with the swarm, especially in windy weather. As long as they are able to go with the swarm, and sometimes when they are not, I have found them sufficiently prolific for all purposes. I would rather risk their fecundity and hive the swarm than to allow the bees to return to the parent stock and wait 8 or 9 days for a young queen to mature. A great many will remain idle even if there is room to work in the boxes. End of chapter 15.
Section 32 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 16. Pruning. Notwithstanding I have given the method of pruning in the chapter on hives, page 23, chapter 2, it will be necessary to give the tyro in bee culture a few more particulars. The season for doing it is of importance. Different opinions as to time. The month of March has been recommended by several. Others prefer April, August, or September. Here, as usual, I shall have to differ from them all, preferring still another period, for which I offer my reasons, supposing, of course, that the reader is conscious of a freeman's privilege, that is, to adopt whatever method he thinks proper, on this as on any other point. Another time preferred. There is but one period from February till October when prosperous stocks are free from young brood in the combs. If combs are taken out when occupied, there must be a loss of all the young bees they contain, which may be avoided. The old queen leaves with the first swarm. All the eggs she leaves in the worker cells will be matured in about 21 days. Consequently, this is the time to clear out the old combs with the least waste. A few drones will be found in the cells that would require a few days more to hatch, but these are of no account. Also, a few very young larvae and some eggs may be sometimes found, the product of the young queen. These few must be wasted, but as the bees have expended no labour upon them as yet, it is better to sacrifice these than the greater number left by her mother, which have consumed their portion of food. The bees have sealed them up, and now only require the necessary time to mature, to make a valuable addition to the stock. Should not be delayed. Should this operation be put off for a time much longer than 3 weeks, the young queen will so fill the combs again as to make it a serious loss. Therefore, I wish to urge strongly attention to this point at the proper season. If you think it unimportant to mark the date of your first swarms for the purposes mentioned in another place, it will be found very convenient here for those that need pruning. It is also recommended by some to take only a part, say 1/3 or half, in a season, thereby taking 2 or 3 years to renew the combs. This is advisable only when the family is very small. As this space made by pruning cannot be filled without wax and labour, our surplus honey will be proportionate to its extent. Now suppose we take out half the old combs and get half a yield of box honey this year, and the same next, or make a full operation of it and get none this year and a full one next. What is the difference? There is none in point of honey, but some in trouble, and that is in favour of a full operation at once. We have to go through with about the same trouble to get 1/3 or half as to take the whole. Objection to pruning. The objection to this mode of renewing combs generally will be the fear of getting stung, but I can assure you there is but little danger, not as much as to walk among the hives in a warm day. Only begin right, use the smoke, and work carefully without pinching them, and you will escape unhurt generally. Stocks pruned now are better for winter. Besides the advantage of saving a large brood by pruning at this season, such stocks will usually refill before fall, and are much better for wintering, which is not the case when it is done later. We must of necessity, then, waste the brood, and have a large space unoccupied with combs through the winter. But few combs can then be made, and those few must be at the expense of their winter stores, unless we resort to feeding. These objections apply with greater force to pruning in March or April. The loss of brood is of much more consequence now than in midsummer or even later, and a space to be filled with combs is a serious disadvantage. It is important that the bees should devote their whole attention now to rearing brood, and be ready to cast their swarms as early as possible. One early swarm is worth 2 late ones. Suppose a stock, instead of collecting food and nursing its young, is compelled to expend its honey and labour in secreting wax and constructing combs before it can proceed with breeding advantageously, it must of necessity be some weeks later. Further, I have always found it best to have the bees out of the way during this operation. It will be found much more difficult to drive the bees out of a hive in the cool weather of March or April than in summer, as they seem unwilling to shift their warm quarters and go into a cold hive. It is presumed the reader will bear in mind the disadvantages already given of too frequently renewing combs, the little value of combs for storing honey for our use after being once used for breeding, the necessity of the bees using them as long as they possibly will answer, and not compel them to be filling the hive when they might be storing honey of the purest quality in boxes, etc. Vide remarks on this subject on page 22, chapter 2. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 17. Diseased Brood. Part 1. This, like many other chapters in this work, is probably new, as I never saw one thus headed. A few newspaper discussions are about all that have yet appeared on this subject. Not generally understood. This disease is probably of recent origin. Mr. Minor, it appears, knew nothing of it until he moved from Long Island to Oneida County in this state. Mr. Weeks, in a communication to the Northeast Farmers, says, "Since the potato rot commenced, I've lost 1/4 of my stocks annually by this disease." At the same time adds his fears that, quote, "this race of insects will become extinct from this cause if not arrested," end quote. Perhaps I ought to mention that he speaks of it as attacking the chrysalis instead of the larva, but as everything else about it agrees exactly, there is but little doubt of its being all one thing. My own experience. My first experience will probably go back to a date beyond many others. It is almost 20 years since the first case was noticed. I had kept bees but 4 or 5 years when I discovered it in one of my best stocks. In fact, it was number 1 in May and 1st of June. It cast no swarm through the summer, and now, instead of being crowded with bees, it contained but very few. So few that I dared not attempt to winter it. What was the matter? I had then never dreamed of ascertaining the condition of a stock while there were bees in the way, but was like the unskilful physician who is obliged to wait for the death of his patient that he may dissect and discover the cause. I accordingly consigned what few bees there were to the brimstone pit. Description of disease. A post-mortem examination revealed the following circumstances. 9/10 of the breeding cells were found to contain young bees in the larva state, stretched out at full length, sealed over, dead, black, putrid, and emitting a disagreeable stench. Now here was one link in the chain of cause and effect. I learned why there was a scarcity of bees in the hive. What should have constituted their increase had died in the cells. None of them were removed. Consequently, but few cells, where any bees could be matured, were left. The cause uncertain. But when I attempted the next link in the chain, to wit, what caused the death of this brood just at this stage of development, I was obliged to stop. Not the least satisfaction could be obtained. All inquiries among the beekeepers of my acquaintance were met with profound ignorance. They had never heard of it. No work on bees that I consulted ever mentioned it. Subsequently, I had more stocks in the same situation. I found whenever the disease existed to any extent that the few bees matured were insufficient to replace those that were lost, that the colony rapidly declined and never afterwards cast a swarm. Remedial experiments. As for remedies, I tried pruning out all those combs containing brood, leaving only such as contained honey, and let the bees construct new for breeding. It was no use. These new combs were invariably filled with diseased brood. The only thing effectual was to drive out the bees into an empty hive. In this way, when done in season, I generally succeeded in rearing a healthy stock. But there was a loss of all surplus honey, and a swarm or two that might have been obtained from a healthy one. Public inquiry and answers. I had so many cases of the kind that I became somewhat alarmed and made inquiry through the Cultivator, an agricultural paper, as to a cause and remedy, offering a reward for one that would not fail when thoroughly tested, etc. Mr. Weeks, in answer, said, quote, that cold weather in spring chilling the brood was the cause. End quote. This was several years prior to his article in the Northeast Farmer. Another gentleman said, quote, dead bees and filth that accumulated during winter when suffered to remain in the spring was the cause. End quote. A few years after, another correspondent appeared in the Cultivator, giving particulars of his experience, proving very conclusively to himself and many others that cold was the cause. Having mislaid the paper containing his article, I will endeavor to quote correctly from memory. He had 3 swarms issue in one day. The weather during the day changed from very hot to the other extreme, producing frost in many places the next morning. These swarms had left but few bees in the old stocks, and the cold forced them up among the combs for mutual warmth. The brood near the bottom, thus left without bees to protect it with animal heat, became chilled, and the consequence was diseased larvae. He then reasoned thus, quote, if the eggs of a fowl at any time near the end of incubation become chilled from any cause, it stops all further development. Bees are developed by continued heat, on the same principle, and a chill produces the same effect, etc. Afterwards, other swarms issued under precisely similar circumstances, but these old stocks were covered with a blanket through the night, which enabled the bees to keep at the bottom of the hive. In a few days, enough were hatched to render this trouble unnecessary. These last remained healthy. End quote. He further says that, quote, last spring was the first time I ever knew them to become diseased before swarming had thinned the population. The weather was remarkably pleasant through April. The bees obtained great quantities of pollen and honey, and by this means extended their brood further than usual at this season. Subsequent chilly weather in May caused the bees to desert a portion of brood, which were destroyed by the chill. End quote. Now this is reasoning from cause to effect very consistently. Answers not satisfactory. Had I no experience further than this, I should perhaps rest satisfied as to the cause, and should endeavour to apply the remedy. Several other writers have appeared in different papers on this subject, and nearly all who assign a cause have given this one as the most probable. Now, I have known the chrysalis in a few stalks to be chilled and destroyed by a sudden turn of cold weather, yet these were removed by the bees soon after, and the stalks remained healthy. To me, the cause assigned appears inadequate to produce all the results with the larvae. After close patient observation of 15 years, I have never yet been wholly satisfied that any one instance among my bees was thus produced. End of section 33. Section 34 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 17. Diseased Bees. Part 2. A cause suggested. We are all familiar to some extent with the contagious diseases of the human family, such as smallpox, whooping cough, and measles, and their rapid spread from a given point, etc. We must also admit that some cause or causes adequate to the effect must have produced the first case. To contagion, then, I would attribute the spread of this disease of our bees, at least 19 cases in 20. I will admit, if you please, that one stock in 20 or 50 may be somewhat affected by a chill to a small extent. It is only a portion of the brood that is in danger, only such as have been sealed over, and before they have progressed to the chrysalis stage, are attacked. How many, then, can there be in a hive at any one time, in just the right stage of development to receive the fatal chill? Of course there will be some, but they should be confined to the cells near the bottom, where the bees had left them exposed. These should be all, and these few would never seriously damage the stock. Why, then, does this disease, when thoroughly started, spread so rapidly throughout all the combs in the hive? Will it be said that the chill is repeated every few days through the summer? Or will it be admitted that something else may continue it? I think there must be other causes besides the chill, even to start it in most cases. As our practice will be in accordance with the view we take of this matter, and the result of our course will be somewhat important, I will give some of the reasons that have led to this conclusion. Reasons for the opinion. For instance, I had all of the bees of a good swarm leave the hive in March. After flying a time, they united with another good stock, making double the usual number of bees at this season, enough to keep the brood sufficiently warm at any time, if other stocks with half or a quarter of the number could. By the middle of June, the bees were much reduced and had not cast a swarm. It was examined, and the brood was found badly diseased. My best and most populous stocks in spring are just as liable, and I might add more so, than smaller or weaker families. I have had 2 large swarms unite, and were hived together, that were diseased the next autumn. These cases prove strongly, if not conclusively, that animal heat is not the only requisite. The fact that when I had pruned out all affected comb from a diseased stock, and left honey in the top and outside pieces, and the bees constructed new for breeding, and the brood in such were invariably affected, though only a few at first, and increasing as the combs were extended, led me to suppose that it was a contagious disease, and the virus was contained in the honey. Some of it had been left in these stocks, and very probably the bees had fed it to the brood. To test this principle still further, I drove all the bees from such diseased stocks, strained the honey, and fed it to several young healthy swarms soon after being hived. When examined a few weeks after, every one, without an exception, had caught the contagion. Here then is a clue to the cause of this disease spreading, whether we have its origin or not. We will now see if we can trace it through, if there is any consistency in its transfer from one stock to another. Cause of its spreading. Suppose one stock has caught the infection, but a small portion of the brood is dead. In the heat of the hive it soon becomes putrid. Other cells adjoining with larvae of the right age are soon in the same condition. All the breeding combs in the hive become one putrid mass, with an exception perhaps of 1 in 10, 20, or 100 that may perfect a bee. Thus the increase of bees is not enough to replace the old ones that are continually dying off. It is plain, therefore, that this stock must soon dwindle down to a very small family. Now let a scarcity of honey occur in the fields. This poor stock cannot be properly guarded, and is easily plundered of its contents by the others. honey is taken that is in close proximity to dead bodies, corrupting by thousands, creating a pestilential vapor of which it has probably absorbed a portion. The seeds of destruction are by this means carried into healthy stocks. In a short time these in turn fall victims to the scourge and soon dwindle away when some other strong stock is able to carry off their stores, and only stop perhaps at the last stalk. The moth is ever ready with her burden of eggs, which she now without hindrance deposits directly on the combs. In a short time the worms finish up the whole business and are judged guilty of the whole charge, merely because they are found carrying out effects that speedily follow such causes. Let the reader who doubts this theory simply strain out honey vitiated in this way and feed it to a few stocks or swarms that are healthy, and if they escape, communicate the fact to the public. But should he become satisfied that such honey is poison to his bees, he will, with me and all others interested, wish to stop this growing evil. Not easily detected at first. It is very difficult to detect the first 100 or 2 that die in a stock, but when 9/10 of the breeding cells hold putrid larvae, there is but very little trouble in making out a correct diagnosis. The bees are few and inactive. When passing the hive, our olfactories are saluted with a nauseous effluvia arising from this corrupting mass. Now, if we wish or expect to escape the most severe penalty, our neglect must never allow this extent of progression before such a stock is removed. Therefore, we must watch symptoms, ascertain the presence of the disease at the earliest moment possible. Symptoms to be observed. As no part of the breeding season is exempt, the stocks should be carefully observed during spring, and for part of summer relative to increase of bees. When one or more is much behind others in this respect, make an examination immediately. I would here urge again the convenience of the simple common hive over those more complicated or suspended and difficult to turn over. In one case we might have an examination in season; in the other, too much trouble and difficulty might cause it to be put off too long. The hive must be inverted and the bees smoked out of the way. Our attention is to be directed to the breeding cells. With a sharp-pointed knife, proceed to cut off the ends of some of them that appear to be the oldest, bearing in mind that young bees are always white until some time after they take the chrysalis state. Therefore, if a larva is found of a dark color, it is dead. Should a dozen such be found, the stock should be condemned at once and all the bees driven into an empty hive. The directions for this have been given. See page 31. If honey should be scarce at the time, they should be fed. Scalding the honey to destroy the poison for feeding. The honey from the old hive may be used if you will only first destroy the virus. This, I have ascertained, may be done by scalding. Add a half pint of water to about 10 pounds, stir it well and heat it to the boiling point, and carefully remove all the scum. Stocks in which the disease has not progressed too far will generally swarm. When to examine stocks that have swarmed. 3 weeks from the first swarm will be the time to examine them. I make it a rule to inspect all my stocks at this period. It is easily done now, as about all the healthy brood, except drones, should be matured in that time. By perseverance in these rules, I allow no stocks to dwindle away until they're plundered by others. If all my neighbors were equally careful, this disease would probably soon disappear. This is like one careless farmer allowing a noxious weed to mature seeds, to be wafted by winds on the lands of a careful neighbor who must fortify his mind to continual vigilance or endure the injury of a foul pest. So with the successful apiarian, in sections where the disease has appeared, it has not in all. He must be continually on the watch. It is the price of success. Care in selecting stock hives for winter. Again, after the breeding season is over in the fall, every stock should be thoroughly inspected and all diseased ones condemned for stock hives. It is better to do it, even if it should take the last one. It would pay much better to procure others instead that are healthy. Persons wishing to eat the honey from such hives will experience no bad effects from it, if they're careful to remove all the dead brood as they take it out of the hive. The greatest distance that I ever knew bees to go and plunder a defenseless stock of its contents was 3/4 of a mile. Very likely they would go farther on some occasions, but not often. Accusations not always right. Careless beekeepers, when their hives are thus robbed, feel regret, or are more often vexed at somebody, at the result of their carelessness. The person keeping most bees in a neighborhood must expect to be accountable for all effects of their ignorance, mismanagement, or carelessness, and consequent bad luck when all the honey thus obtained probably carries with it more mischief than can be eradicated in a 12-month, thereby giving the real cause of complaint to the other party. End of section 34, read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Chapter 18 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by dfixsen. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 18, Irritability of Bees. Irritability of bees. Keeping bees good-natured offers a pretty fair subject for ridicule. It seems rather too absurd to teach a bee anything. Nevertheless, it is worthwhile to think of it a little. Most of us know that by injudicious training, horses, cattle, dogs, etc., may be rendered extremely vicious. If there is no perceptible analogy between these and bees, experience proves that they may be made 10 times more irritable than they naturally would be. Their means of defense. Nature has armed them with means to defend their stores and provided them with combativeness sufficient to use them when necessary. This could not be bettered. If they were powerless to repel an enemy, there are 1,000 lazy predators, man not excepted, who would prey upon the fruits of their industry, leaving them to starve. Had it been so arranged, this industrious insect would probably have long since been extinct. Time of greatest irritability. The season of their greatest caution in this section is August, during the flowers of buckwheat. It is then their stores are greatest. As soon as a stock is pretty well supplied with this world's goods, like some bipeds, they become very haughty, proud, aristocratic, and insolent. A great many things are construed into insults that in their days of adversity would pass unnoticed. But now it is becoming and proper for their honor to show a just resentment. It behooves us, therefore, to ascertain what are considered insults. Proper conduct. First of all, motions such as running, striking, etc. about them are noticed. If our movements among them are slow, cautious, humble, and respectful, we are often let to pass unmolested, having manifested a becoming deportment. Yet the exhalation from some persons appear very offensive, as they attack them much sooner than others, though I apprehend there is not so great a difference as many suppose. Whenever an attack is made and a sting follows, the venom is thus imparted to the air, if by only one, is perceived by others at some distance, which will immediately approach the scene, and more stings are likely to follow than if the first had not been. How to proceed when attacked. Striking them down renders them 10 times more furious. Not in the least daunted, they return to the attack. Not the least show of fear is perceived. Even after losing their sting, they obstinately refuse to desist. It is much the best way to walk as quietly as possible to the shelter of some bush or to the house. They will seldom go inside of the door. A person's breath offensive, and other causes. The breath of a person inside the hive or among them when clustered outside is considered in the tribunals of their insect wisdom as the greatest indignity. A sudden jar, sometimes made by carelessly turning up the hive, is another. After being once thoroughly irritated in this way, they remember it for weeks and are continually on the alert. The moment the hive is touched, they are ready to salute a person's face. When slides of tin or zinc are used to cut off the communication between the hives and boxes, some of the bees are apt to be crushed or cut in two. This they remember and retaliate as occasion offers, and it may be when quietly walking in the apiary. Their manner of attack. I must disagree with anyone who says we always have warning before being stung. I've been stung a few times myself. 2/3 of them were received without the least notice. The first intimation was the blow. At other times, when fully determined on vengeance, I have had them strike my hat and remain a moment endeavoring to effect their object. In this case, I have warning to hold down my face to protect it from the next attempt, which is quite sure to follow. As they fly horizontally, the face held in that position is not so liable to be attacked. When they are not so thoroughly charged with anger, they often approach in merely a threatening attitude, buzzing around very provokingly for several minutes in close proximity to our ears and face, apparently to ascertain our intentions. If nothing hostile or displeasing is perceived, they will generally leave, but should a quick motion or offensive breath offend them, the dreaded result is almost sure to follow. Too many people are apt to take these threatening manifestations as positive intentions to sting. When these things can be quietly endured, and at the same time leave their vicinity, it generally ends peaceably. They never make an attack while away from their home in quest of honey, or on their return, until they have entered the hive. It is only in the hive and its vicinity that we expect to meet this irascible temperament, which should not be allowed, or at least may be subdued in a great measure, if not entirely, by doing things in a quiet manner and by the use of tobacco smoke. Any person having the care of bees should go armed with this powerful weapon. As bees are not much affected with smoke while flying in the air, but will have their own way, we must take them in the hive as the place to teach them a proper deportment. Those who are accustomed to smoking will find a pipe or cigar very convenient here. But such as are not would do better, perhaps, not to learn a bad habit. I will therefore give a simple substitute. Smoker described. Get a tube of tin about 5/8 of an inch in diameter, 5 or 6 inches in length. Make stoppers of wood to fit both ends, 2½ or 3 inches long. With your nail gimlet, make a hole through them lengthwise. When put together, it should be about 10 inches. The ends may be tapered. On one end, leave a notch, that it may be held with the teeth, which is the most convenient way, as you will often want to use both hands. It is also always ready, without any trouble to blow through, and also to keep the tobacco burning. When ready to operate, fill the tube with tobacco, ignite it, and put in the stoppers. By blowing through it, you keep the tobacco burning while the smoke issues at the other end. Effect of tobacco smoke. We can now subdue these combative propensities or render them harmless, turn their anger into submission, and make them yield their treasures to the hands of the spoiler without an effort of resistance. When once overpowered, they seem to lose all knowledge of their strength, and no slave can be more submissive. After the effects of the smoke have passed off, their former animosity will return. Should any resentment be shown on raising a hive, blow in the smoke. They immediately retreat, begging pardon. After a few times, they learn it's no use, and allow an inspection. If you wish to take off a box, raise it just enough to blow under the smoke. There is no trouble. You can replace it with another. The bees are kept out of the way with a little more smoke, and no anger created about it to be remembered. Those in the box are all submission. They can be carried away and handled as you please, without a possibility of getting them irritated, until once more get home, and then are much more amiable than if the box had been taken without the smoke. They seem to forget or do not realize anything of the transaction. When bees are to be transferred to a new hive, it is unnecessary to be so very particular about the escape of a single bee. No fears need to be entertained of such as get out. In driving, the loud humming indicates their submission. The upper hive can then be safely raised at any time. After being thus driven out, they may be pushed about with impunity and still be quiet. In short, by using smoke on all occasions where they would be likely to be disturbed without it by our meddling with them, it has a tendency to keep dormant their combative propensities. When these have never been aroused, there is much less danger from their attacks while walking or looking among them. Anyone wishing further proof, I would recommend the experiment of managing 1 year with smoke and the next without. Sting described. Their sting, as it appears to the naked eye, is but a tiny instrument of war, so small indeed that its wound would pass unheeded by all the larger animals if it was not for the poison introduced at the same instant. It has been described as being composed of 3 parts, a sheath and 2 darts. Both the darts are furnished with small points or barbs like a fishhook that hold it in when introduced into the flesh, the bee being compelled to leave it behind. Does its loss prove fatal? It is said to the bee itself this mutilation proves fatal. This last is another assertion for fact, so often repeated that perhaps we might as well admit it, seeing the difficulty we should have in disproving it. Only think of the impossibility of keeping your eye for 5 minutes on a bee that is flying about after it has left its sting. Yet there are some persons so very particular about what they receive as facts that they would require this very unreasonable thing of watching a bee till it died before they could be positively sure that the loss of its sting caused its death. It is much easier to guess. They might even take analogy and say that other insects possess so little sensation that they have been known to recover after much more extensive mutilation, that beetles have lived for months under circumstances that would have instantly killed some of the higher animals, that spiders often reproduce a leg, even lobsters can replace a lost claw, etc. I've put off describing any protection against their attacks, because I wish to get up a little more courage in our doings among them. Yet it is folly to expect all will manage successfully without something for defense. Means of protection. The face and hands are most exposed. For the latter, thick woolen mittens or gloves are the best. The sting is generally left when thrust into a leather glove. For the face, procure 1½ yards of thin muslin or calico. Sew the ends together, the upper end gathered on a string small enough to prevent it slipping over the head when put on. An armhole is best to be cut on each side. Below is another string to gather it close to the body. As I do not expect you to work in the dark, we will have a place cut out in front and a piece of coarse lace inserted. That which will just prevent a bee from passing is best, as it gives us a better chance to see. To keep it from falling against the face, a wire is bent around and sewed fast. Any person that knows how to put on a shirt will manage this. When thus equipped, and other garments of proper thickness, the most timid ought not to hesitate to venture among them when necessary. I cannot avoid cautioning you again to beware of irritating your bees, until this protection is necessary, as it is a rather bad state of things. With this on, you cannot conveniently use any smoke. To put this on and off is considerable trouble, and every time you go among them, I fear some necessary duties will be neglected. Whenever a partial protection will do, I would recommend a handkerchief. It is always at hand and can be put on in a moment. Throw it over the head, letting the ends fall around the neck and shoulders, covering all but the face. The hat can come on over it. As for the face, whenever a bee comes around in a menacing attitude, hold it down. Unless he stings at the first onset, there is not much risk. Remedies for stings. Concerning the remedies for stings, it is a hard matter to tell which is the best. There is so much difference in the effect in different individuals and the different parts of the body, as well as the depth the sting reaches, that a great variety of remedies are recommended. A person is slightly stung and applies something as an antidote. The effect of the sting is trifling, as perhaps it would have been without anything, and the medicine is forthwith extolled as a sovereign remedy. I have been thus deceived. When slightly stung, applied what I thought cured in one case, when in the next sting might have penetrated deeper, or in some other place, and the remedy would seem to have no effect. For the last few years I have not made any application whatsoever for myself, and the effect is no worse, nor even as bad as formerly. This, I am told, is because the system is hardened, and now can resist or throw off the effects. Among the remedies recommended are saleratus and water, salt and water, soft soap mixed with salt, a raw onion cut in 2 and 1/2 applied, mud or clay mixed pretty wet and changed often, tobacco wet and rubbed thoroughly to get at the strength and cold water constantly applied. To cure the smart, the application of tobacco is strongly urged, and cold water is spoken of with equal favor to prevent the swelling. When stung in the throat, drinking often of salt and water is said will prevent serious consequences. Whether any of these remedies are applied or not, I suppose it is unnecessary to say that the sting should be pulled out as soon as practicable. End of Chapter 18.
Section 36 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Katina Papadakis. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 19. Enemies of Bees, Part 1. Among the enemies of bees there are included rats, mice, birds, toads, and insects. Are they all guilty? But some of these are probably clear of any actual mischief. I strongly suspect that the spirit of destructiveness with many people is altogether too active. There are some farmers, with this principle predominant, so short-sighted that if it was in their power they would destroy a whole class of birds, because some of them had picked a few cherries, or dug out a few hills of corn, when at the same time they are indebted to their activity in devouring worms, insects, etc., that would otherwise have destroyed entire crops. It will be well, therefore, before condemnation, to see if on the whole we are to be gainers or losers by an indiscriminate slaughter without judge or jury. Rats and mice. Rats and mice are never troublesome, except in cold weather. The entrances of all hives standing out are too small to admit a rat. It is only when in the house that much damage need be apprehended. They appear to be fond of honey, and when it is accessible will eat several pounds in a short time. Mice will often enter the hive when standing on the bench, and make extensive depredations. Sometimes, after eating a space in the combs, they will there make their nest. The animal heat created by the bees will make a snug, warm place for winter quarters. There are two kinds, one the common class, belonging to the house, the other called deer mouse, the underside perfectly white, the back much lighter than the other kind. The latter seem to be particularly fond of the bees, while the first appears to relish the honey. Whether they take bees that are alive, or only such as are already dead, I cannot say. Only a part of the bee is eaten, and if we take the fragments left to judge of the number consumed, the circumstance will go some ways to prove the sacrifice of quite a number. Whether bees or honey is wasted, a little care to prevent their depredations is well worthy of bestowal. As rats and mice have so long since been condemned and sentenced for being a universal plague, and without a redeeming trait, I will say nothing in their favor, and am perfectly willing they shall be hanged till dead. Are all the birds guilty? But for some of the birds accused of preying upon bees, I would say a word. Kingbird, one word in his favor. The kingbird stands at the head of the list of depredators. With a fair trial he will be found guilty, though not so heinously criminal as many suppose. I think we shall find him guilty of taking only the drones. In the afternoon of a fair day he may be seen perched upon some dry branch of a shrub or tree near the apiary, watching for his victims, occasionally darting to seize them. I have shot him down and examined his crop, after seeing him devour a goodly number, but in every instance the bees were so crushed to pieces that it was impossible to distinguish workers from drones. We are told of great numbers of workers being counted. It may be so, or it may be thus represented by a spice of prejudice. I have found the brutal gratification of taking life so strong with some that a natural antipathy is allowed to take the place of justice, and a proper defense is not allowed in such cases where the suffering party has not the power to enforce it. If he was satisfied with workers as well as drones, why does he not visit the apiary long before noon, and fill his crop with them? But instead he waits till afternoon for the drones, and if none are flying, he watches quietly till one appears, although workers may be out by hundreds continually. If the question is asked how they tell the difference in the two kinds of bees, I might suggest that instinct has taught most animals the proper kind of food, and might direct the birds in this case. If it was not sufficient, a little experience in catching bees provided with stings might impart the important difference in 1 or 2 lessons. I once had a chicken that knew the difference by some means, and would stand by the hive and devour every drone the moment it touched the board, while the workers would pass by him in scores untouched. Now, whether this taking the drones is a disadvantage or otherwise would depend entirely upon circumstances. If honey was a little scarce, the less we had of them, the better. It would also save the bees some trouble in dispatching them. It is probably a matter of so little moment to our bees that it will not pay for powder to shoot them. Martins and a kind of swallows are said to be guilty of taking bees on some occasions, but as they pursue them on the wing, if they do, the same remarks will apply as to the kingbird. Catbird acquitted. The catbird also comes in for a share of censure. It is said they will get right down by the hive and pick up bees by the 100. Yet, right in the face of this charge, I am disposed to acquit him. With the closest observation, I find him about the hive, picking up only young and immature bees, such as are removed from the combs and thrown out. They may be seen as soon as the first rays of light make objects visible about the apiary, looking for their morning supply, as well as frequent visits during the day. Should an unlucky worm be in sight just then, while looking up a place for spinning a cocoon, or a moth reposing on some corner of the hive, their fate is at once decided. Before destroying this bird, it would be well to judge by actual observation as to facts. Otherwise, we might destroy a friend instead of a foe. Toad got clear. A toad is discovered near the hives, and forthwith he is executed as a bee-eater. He ought to be killed for his looks, if nothing else. He is thus often sacrificed really on account of his appearance, while pretending he is a villain. It is true his feathers will not vie in brilliancy with the plumage of the hummingbird, and do not gratify ideality. Therefore he is dispatched. The next week the complaint is made that the little bugs that he might have destroyed have eaten up all the little cucumbers and cabbages. His food is probably small insects. Whoever has seen him swallow bees must have watched closer than I ever did. Wasps and hornets not favored. As for the frequent visits of the black wasp in the sunny days of spring, but little can be said in their favor. They seem to have no other object but to tease and irritate the bees. I never could discover that they entered the hive for the purpose of plunder. They have frequent battles with the bees, but I never saw any bees devoured or carried off, nor even killed. After the 1st of June they are seldom troublesome. The yellow wasp or hornet that is around in autumn is of but little account. Their object is honey, which they take when they can get it, but are not apt to enter the hive among the bees. Ants, a word in their favor. Ants come in for a share of condemnation. This little industrious insect shall have my endeavors for a fair hearing. I think I can understand why they are so frequently accused of robbing bees. Many beekeepers are wholly ignorant most of the time of the real condition of their stocks. Many causes independent of ants induce a reduction of population. Suppose the bees are so reduced as to leave the combs unprotected, and the ants enter and appropriate some of the honey to themselves, and should the owner come along just then and see them engaged, "Ha! You are the rascals that have destroyed my bees," without a thought of looking for causes beyond present appearances. They are often unjustly accused by the farmer of injuring the growth of his little trees by causing the tender leaves to curl and wither. Inquiries are often made in some of the agricultural papers for means to destroy them, merely because they are found on them, when the real cause of the mischief is with the plant louse, aphis, that is upon the leaves or stalk in hundreds, robbing them of their important juices, and secreting a fluid greatly prized by the ants. By destroying the lice, you remove all the attraction of the ants. The peculiar habits of the small black ants probably give rise to a suspicion of mischief in this way. They live in communities of thousands. Their nests are usually in old walls, in old timber, under stones, and in the earth. From their nests a string may be traced, sometimes for rods, going after and returning laden with food. During a spell of wet weather, such as would make the earth and many other places too damp and cold for a nest, they look out for better quarters. The top or chamber of our beehives affords shelter from rain. The animal heat from the bees renders it perfectly comfortable. How then can we blame them for choosing such a location, so completely answering all their wants? As long as the bees are not disturbed, we can put up with it better. But the careless observer, having discovered their train to and fro from their nest on the hive, exclaims, "Why, I have seen them going in a continual stream to the hive after honey," when a little scrutiny into the matter would show that only the nest was on top of the hive, and they were going somewhere else for food, not one to be seen entering the hive among the bees for honey. At least I never could detect it. When honey is unprotected by bees, or boxes of it placed where they can have access, as a natural consequence they will carry off some, but it is easily secured. End of section 36.
Section 37 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 19, Enemies of Bees, Part 2. Spider Condemned. Spiders are a source of considerable annoyance to the apiarian as well as to the bees, not so much on account of the number of bees consumed as their habit of spinning a web about the hive that will occasionally take a moth and will probably entangle 50 bees the whilst. They are either in fear of the bees or they are not relished as food, particularly as a bee caught in the morning is frequently untouched during the day. This web is often exactly before the entrance, entangling the bees as they go out and return, irritating and hindering them considerably. They often escape after repeated struggles. I have removed a web from the same place every morning for a week that was renewed at night with astonishing perseverance. I can generally look out his hiding place, which is in some corner nearby, and dispatch him. His redeeming qualities are few and are more than balanced by the evil as far as I have discovered. Their sagacity in some instances will find a place of concealment not easily discovered. At the approach of cold weather, the box or chamber of the hive, being a little warmer than other places, will attract a great many there to deposit their eggs. Little piles of webbing or silk may be seen attached to the top of the hive or sides of the boxes. These contain eggs for the next year's brood. This is the time to destroy them and save trouble for the future. If we combine into one phalanx all the predators yet named and compare their ability for mischief with the wax moth, we shall find their powers of destruction but a small item. Of the moth itself we would have nothing to fear were it not for her progeny, that consist of 100 or 1,000 vile worms, whose food is principally wax or comb. As the instinct of a flesh fly directs her to a putrid carcass to deposit her eggs, that her offspring may have their proper food, so the moth seeks the hive containing combs, and where its natural food is at hand, to furnish a supply. During the day, a rusty brown miller, with its wings wrapped close round the body, may be often seen lying perfectly motionless on the side of the hive on one corner, or under the edge of the top where it projects over. They are more frequent at the corners than anywhere else, 1/3 of their length projecting beyond it, appearing much like a sliver on the edge of a board that is somewhat weather-beaten. Their color so closely resembles old wood that I have no doubt their enemies are often deceived and let them escape with their lives. As soon as daylight shuts out the view and no danger of their movements being discovered by their enemies, they throw off their inactivity and commence searching for a place to deposit their eggs, and woe to the stock that has not bees sufficient to drive them from the comb. Although their larva has a skin that the bee cannot pierce with its sting, in most cases it is not so with the moth, and of this fact they seem to be aware, for whenever a bee approaches, they dart away with speed 10 times greater than that of any bee disposed to follow. They enter the hive and dodge out in a moment, having either encountered a bee or fear they may do so. Now, it needs no argument to prove that when all our stocks are well protected, that it must be a poor chance to deposit eggs on the combs of such hives where their instinct has taught them is the proper place. But they must leave them somewhere. When driven from all the combs within, the next best place is the cracks and flaws about the hive that are lined with propolis, and the dust and chips that fall on the floorboard of a young swarm not full will be used. This last material is mostly wax and answers very well instead of comb. The eggs will here hatch, and the worms sometimes ascend to the combs, hence the necessity of keeping the bottom brushed off clean. It will prevent those that are on the bottom from going up. Also the bees from taking up any eggs if this should happen to be the method. I can conceive of no other way by which they get among the combs of a populous stock, where they are often detected, having been deposited by some means. A worm lodged in the comb makes his way to the center, and then eats a passage as he proceeds, lining it with a shroud of silk, gradually enlarging it as he increases in size. When combs are filled with honey, they work on the surface, eating only the ceiling. In very weak families, this silken passageway is left untouched, but removed by all the stronger ones. I have found it asserted that the worms would be all immediately destroyed by the bees were it not for a kind of dread in touching them until compelled to by necessity. As the facts which led to this conclusion are not given, and I can find none confirming it, perhaps I shall be excused if I have no faith. On the contrary, I find to all appearance an instinctive antipathy to all such intruders, and are removed immediately when possessing the power. When a worm is in a comb filled with brood, its passage being in the center, it is not at first discovered. The bees, to get out, must bite away half the thickness, removing the brood in 1 or 2 rows of cells, sometimes for several inches. This will account for so many immature bees found on the bottom board at morning, in the spring, as well as in stocks and swarms, but partially protected after the swarming season. Indications of their presence. Sometimes a half-dozen young bees, nearly mature, will be removed alive, all webbed together, fastened by legs, wings, etc. All their efforts for breaking loose prove unavailing. Also, others that are separate may be seen running about with their wings mutilated, or part of their legs eaten off, or tied together. These generally are the first symptoms of worms in our stock at this season. Although unfavorable, it might be worse. It shows that bees are not discouraged yet, that when finding the worms present, have sufficient energy left to make an effort to rid themselves of the nuisance. Management. Should the apiarian now give them a little assistance for a few days, they will soon be in a prosperous condition. The hive should be frequently raised and everything brushed out clean. If it is a new swarm half full that presents these indications, it should be turned over a few times, perhaps once a week, till the worms are mastered and the corners below the bees examined for the cocoons that will very often be found there and are easily detached and destroyed. In turning over a hive part full in warm weather, you should first observe the position of the combs and let the edges rest against the side of the hive. Otherwise, they might bend over and break loose when the hive was again set up. By simply making a pencil mark across the top in the direction of the combs, you may know at any time after first looking. Care in turning over hives. When a hive is full of combs, the edges are usually attached sufficient to steady them, and it is of less consequence which way it is turned. Yet, in very warm weather, the honey will run out of drone cells if perpendicular. In very small swarms, hundreds of the young brood may be frequently seen with their heads out of the cells, endeavoring to escape, but are firmly held inside by these webs. I have known a few instances in such circumstances where it appeared as if the bees had cut off the whole sheet of comb and let it drop, thereby ridding themselves of all further trouble, or would be rid of it if their owner only did his part by taking out what fell down. Other symptoms of worms. But when the bees make no effort to dislodge the enemy or his works in old stocks, the case is somewhat desperate. Instead of the foregoing symptoms, we must look for something entirely different. But few young bees will be found. In their place we may find the feces of the worms dropped on the board. During the winter and spring, the bees, in biting off the covering of cells to get at the honey, drop chips closely resembling it. To detect the difference and distinguish one from the other requires a little close inspection. The color of the feces varies with the comb on which they feed, from white to brown and black. The size of these grains will be in proportion to the worm, from a mere speck to nearly as large as a pinhead, shape cylindrical with obtuse ends, length about twice its diameter. By the quantity we can judge of the number. If the hive is full of combs, the lower ends may appear perfect, while the middle or upper part is sometimes a mat of webs. Whenever our stocks have become reduced from overswarming or other cause, this is the next effect in succession that we must expect. Here is another important reason that we know the actual condition of our bees at all times. We can then detect the worms very soon after they commence. In some instances, we might save the stock by breaking out most of the combs, leaving just enough to be covered by the bees. When success attends this operation, it must be done before the worms have progressed to a thorough lodgment. When the stock is weak and appearances indicate the presence of many, it is generally the safest and will be the least trouble in the end to drive out the bees at once and secure the honey and wax. The bees, when put into a new hive, may do a little, but if they should do nothing, it would be no worse. It cannot be as bad anyway as to have left them in the old hive till the worms had destroyed all and matured 1,000 or 2 moths in addition to those otherwise produced, thereby multiplying the chances of damage to other stocks 1,000-fold. It is probably remembered that I said when bees are removed from a hive in warm weather, if it was not infested with worms at the time, it soon would be, unless smoked with sulfur. End of section 37. Section 38 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 19, Enemies of Bees, Part 3. When they grow larger than usual. In a hive thus left without bees to interfere, the worms will increase to 1/2 or 2/3 larger than where their right to the combs is disputed. In one case, they often have their growth and actually wind up in their cocoon when less than an inch in length. In the other, they will quietly fatten till they are 1.5 inches long and as large as a pipe stem. Time of growth. When first hatched from the egg, it requires very close inspection to see them with the naked eye. The rapidity of growth depends on the temperature in which they are, as much or more than their good living. A few days in hot weather might develop the full-grown worm, while in a lower temperature it would require weeks or even months in some cases, perhaps from fall till spring. Time of transformation. The worm, after spinning its cocoon, soon changes to a chrysalis and remains inactive for several days, when it makes an opening in one end and crawls out. The time taken for this transformation is also governed by the temperature, although I think but few ever pass the winter in this state. It is a rare thing to find a moth before the end of May, and not many till the middle of June, but after this time they are more numerous till the end of the season. Freezing destroys worms, cocoon, and moth. It is pretty well demonstrated that the moth, its eggs, larva, and chrysalis cannot pass the winter without warmth of some kind to prevent their freezing to death. The following facts indicate this. I have taken all the bees out of a hive in the fall, and without disturbing the comb or honey, put it in a cold chamber where it could freeze thoroughly. In the following March, bees were again introduced, and when not on a bench with some other stock that had worms, not a single instance in 40 cases has ever produced a worm before the middle of June, or until the eggs of some moth matured in another hive has had time to hatch. I have sometimes, instead of putting bees in these in March, kept them till June for swarms, perfectly free from any appearance of worms. How they pass the winter. But it is altogether a different thing with our hives in which bees are wintered. They are seldom or never entirely exempt. Perhaps it is impossible to winter bees without preserving some eggs of the moth or a few worms at the same time. The perfect moth perhaps never survives the winter. The only place that the chrysalis would be safe, I think, must be in the vicinity of the bees, and a good stock will never allow it there. But eggs, it would appear, are suffered to remain. In the fall, at the approach of cold weather, the bees are apt to leave the ends of the combs exposed. The moth can now enter and deposit her eggs directly upon them. These, together with what are carried in by means before suggested, are enough to prevent losing the breed. The warmth generated by the bees will keep these eggs from freezing and preserve their vitality. When warm weather approaches in the spring, those nearest the bees are probably hatched first and commence depredations and are removed by the bees. As the bees increase and occupy more comb, more are warmed up and hatched. In this way, even a small family of bees will hatch and get rid of all the eggs that happen to be in their combs and not be destroyed. This is the time that the apiarian may be of service in destroying the worms as the bees get them on the floor. Stocks more liable to be destroyed last of summer. But in July and August it is different in this respect. A single moth may enter the hive when exposed and deposit her whole burden of several hundred eggs, as in the other case, but the heat from the bees is now unnecessary to hatch them. The weather at this season will make any part of the hive warm enough to set her whole brood at work at once, and in 3 weeks all may be destroyed. This, and the fact that more moths exist now than before, may account for the greater number of stocks being destroyed at this season. Yet it is considered extremely bad management to allow honey or combs to be devoured by this disgusting creature. A little care to know the condition of the stocks is necessary to prevent their getting the start. These duties should be fully considered before we take the responsibility of the care of bees. When bees are safe. The only condition when we can rest and feel safe is when we know all our stocks are full of bees. Even the moth-proof hive containing combs will be scented out by the moth when there are no bees to guard it. An argument to show that a moth can enter where a bee can go is unnecessary, and a little observation, I think, will prove that her eggs sometimes go where she is not allowed. Means to destroy them. At this season, July and August, it is a good plan to put a few pieces of old dry combs near the hives in a box or other place as a decoy where the moth may have access. She will deposit a great many of her eggs here instead of the hive and can be easily destroyed. As we cannot always have our bees in a situation to feel safe, it will be well to adopt some of the means recommended to diminish the number of moths. First, destroy all the worms that can be found at any time, particularly in the spring. Second, all cocoons that can be got at. A great many worms can be enticed to web up under a trap of elder, etc., when it is an easy matter to dispatch them. Thirdly, destroy all the moths possible that can be seen about the hive. They are very much like the flea. When you put your finger on him, he is not there. A careful move is necessary to crush him at once. Otherwise, he darts away at the least disturbance. Probably the most expeditious mode is to make them drunk. Making them drunk and their execution by chickens. Mix with water just enough molasses and vinegar to make it palatable. This is to be put in white saucers or other dishes and set among the hives at night. Like nobler beings, if not wiser, when once they have tasted the fatal beverage, they seem to lose all power to leave the fascinating cup, but give way to appetite and excitement till a fatal step plunges them into destruction. The next morning finds them yet wallowing in filth, weak and feeble. Whether they would recover from the effects of their carousal if lifted out of the mire and carefully nursed like other specimens of creation, I never ascertained. But with little trouble, a chicken or two will learn to be on hand and greedily devour every one. Hundreds are caught in this way, although many other kinds besides the bee moth will be mixed with them. This drink may be used till dried up, occasionally adding a little water. Perhaps it is better after fermenting. This recipe appeared some years ago in some paper. I have forgotten where. Salt has been recommended to prevent the mischief of worms, as well as a benefit to the bees. I used it pretty extensively for several years, as I thought without much benefit, and got tired. I then tried salting a part and let the rest do entirely without, and found no difference in their prosperity. Since then, some 10 years ago, I abandoned its use altogether and succeed just as well. End of section 38.
Section 39 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 20. Melting Down of Combs. The Cause. When extreme hot weather occurs, immediately after the bees have been gathering from a plentiful harvest for 2 or 3 weeks, or even during the yield, the wax composing new combs is very liable to be softened till they break loose from their fastenings and settle to the bottom. Effects. Sometimes the injury is trifling, only a piece or two slipping down. At other times the whole contents fall in a confused and broken mass, the weight pressing out the honey and besmearing the bees, which in that situation creep out and away from the hive in every direction. I once had some new stocks ruined and several others injured by hot weather in this way, about the 1st of September, immediately after the flowers of buckwheat. The bees, or most of them, being covered with honey, together with what ran out of the hive, at once attracted bees from the others to the spot, which carried off the entire contents in a few hours. This was an uncommon occurrence. I have known but one season in 25 years when it occurred, after the failure of honey in the flowers. It usually happens during a plenteous yield, and then other stocks are not apt to be troublesome. First indications. The first indication of such an accident will be the bees outside in clusters, when the hive is perhaps only half or 2/3 full, and the honey running out from the bottom. This is when part has fallen. Prevention. To prevent such occurrences, as far as possible, ventilate by raising the hives on little blocks at the corners, and effectually protect them from the sun, and if necessary wet the outside with cold water. At the time of losing those before mentioned, I kept all the rest of the young swarms wet through the middle of the day, and I have no doubt but I saved several by this means. I had some trouble with such as had only a piece or two come down, and started just honey enough to attract other bees. It was not safe to close the hive to prevent the robbers, as this would have made the heat still greater, and been certain destruction. The best protection I found was to put around the bottom of the hive a few stems of asparagus. This gave a free circulation of air, and at the same time made it very difficult for the robbers to approach the entrance without first creeping through this hedge and encountering some bees that belonged to the hive, which, with this assistance, were enabled to defend themselves till all wasting honey was taken up. When the hive is nearly full, and but 1 or 2 sheets come down, the lower edge will rest on the floor, and the other combs will keep it in an upright position, until the bees fasten it again. It is generally as well to leave such pieces as they are. If the hive is but half full, or little more, and such pieces are not kept perpendicular by the remaining combs, they are apt to be broken and crushed badly by falling so far, and most of the honey will be wasted. To save this, it will be necessary to remove it, unless a dish can be made to catch it. Be careful not to turn the hive on its side and break the remaining combs, if any are left. Such combs as contain brood but little honey might be left for the brood to mature. Should the bees be able to take the honey, or not waste much, it might be advisable to leave it till the contents were taken up. It would greatly assist in filling up. But these broken pieces should be removed before they interfere with the combs extending to the bottom. A part of the bees are generally destroyed, but the majority will escape. Even such as are covered with honey, if they are not crushed, will clean it off and soon be in working order, when others do not interfere officiously, assisting to remove it. A good yield of honey is the best protection against this disposition to pillage. After the first year, combs become thicker and are not so liable to give way. End of section 39.
Section 40 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 21. Fall Management, Part 1. First, care. When the flowers fail at the end of the season, the first thing necessary is to ascertain which are the weakest stalks, and all that cannot defend themselves should either be removed or reinforced. The strength of all stalks is pretty thoroughly tested within a few days after a failure of honey. Should any be found with too few bees for defense, they are quite sure to be plundered. Hence the necessity of action in season, that we may secure the contents in advance of the robbers. Strong stalks disposed to plunder. Strong stalks that during a yield have occupied every cell with brood and honey, when it fails will soon have empty cells left by the young bees hatching. These empty cells, without honey to fill them, appear to be a source of much uneasiness. Although such hive and caps may be well stored, I have ever found them to be the worst in the apiary, much more disposed to plunder than weaker ones with half the honey. As weak stalks cannot be bettered now, it is best to remove them at once and put the temptation out of the way. Carelessness is but a sorry excuse for letting bees establish this habit of dishonesty. Should any stalks be weak from disease, the consequences would be even more disastrous than bad habits. The reasons why such impure honey should not go into thrifty stalks have already been given. If we want the least possible trouble with our bees, none but the best should be selected for winter. But what constitutes a good stalk seems to be but partially understood. If we judge from the number lost annually, too many are careless or ignorant in the selection. Supposing perhaps because a stalk has been good one winter and swarmed well, it must of course be right, the mistake is often fatal. Bees changeable. Bees are so changeable, especially in the summer and swarming season, that we can seldom be certain what they are by what they have been. It is safest, therefore, to know what they are now. Requisites for good stalks. The proper requisites for a good stalk are a full hive of proper shape and size, viz. 2,000 inches, well stored with honey, a large family of bees, and in healthy condition, which must be ascertained by actual inspection. The age is not important till over 8 years old. Stocks possessing these points can be wintered with but little trouble, but it cannot be expected that all will be in this condition. Many beekeepers will wish to increase their stocks and keep all that is practicable by supplying any deficiency. I shall endeavor to make it appear profitable to do so, until bees enough are kept in the country to get all the honey that is now wasted. All can understand why it is a loss to have bees eat honey part of the winter and then die, that the honey consumed might have been saved, that it makes no great difference to the bees whether they are killed in the fall or sacrificed in the winter. I am not an advocate for fire and brimstone as the reward of all unfortunate stocks, and shall recommend it only when its use will make it no worse. We will see how far it can be dispensed with. Great disadvantage of killing the bees. Those rustic beekeepers who are in the habit of making their hives very large, such as will hold from 100 to 140 pounds, and killing the bees in the fall and sending the honey to market, will probably continue the use of sulphur, unless we can convince them of the greater advantage of making the hives smaller and have 50 or 80 pounds of this honey in boxes, which will sell for more than can be realized for their larger hive full, and at the same time save their bees for a stock hive, making a better return in the long run than $100 at interest. When hives are made the proper size, the honey will not be an object sufficient to pay for destroying the bees. Section of country may make a difference in what poor stocks need. The kind of requisite to be supplied to our deficient stocks will probably depend on this section of country. Where the principal source is clover and basswood, it will fail partially, at least, before the end of warm weather. Some poor or medium stocks will continue to rear brood too extensively for their means, and exhaust their winter stores in consequence. Such will need a supply of honey, but where great quantities of buckwheat are sown, cold weather follows almost immediately after this yield and stops the breeding. Consequently, a scarcity of bees is more frequent than honey. There are exceptions, of course. I'm speaking of these cases generally. My experience has mostly been in a section where this crop is raised, and will say that there is not more than one season in 10, but that the honey will be in proportion with the bees the 1st of September. That is, if there are bees enough, there will be honey enough. When bees are needed. I have frequently had stocks with stores amply sufficient to carry a good family through the winter, and yet too few bees to last till January, or even to defend themselves from the robbers. Hence I'm in the habit of supplying bees oftener than honey. I usually have some few hives with too little honey as well as too few bees. Now it is very plain if the bees of one or more of this class were united with the first successfully, we should have a respectable family. I have made additions to stocks in this way that proved first-rate. Caution. Whenever we make additions in this manner, it would be well first to ascertain what was the cause of a scarcity of bees. If it was over-swarming or loss of queen, it's well enough. But if from disease, reject them unless the bees are to be transferred the next spring, and then when too many cells are occupied with dead brood, as the bees cannot be successfully wintered. Principal difficulty. The greatest difficulty in uniting two families or more in this manner is where they have to be taken from different places in the same apiary, where the locations have been marked. It is sufficiently shown that bees return to the old stand. To prevent these results, it has been recommended, to set an empty hive with some pieces of comb fastened on the top in the place of the one removed, to catch the bees that go back to the old stand and remove them at night for a few times when they remain." This should be done only when we cannot do better. It is considerable trouble. Besides this, we do not always succeed to our satisfaction. How avoided? I like the plan of bringing them a mile or more for this purpose, and have no other trouble about it. Two neighbors being that distance apart, each having stocks in this condition, might exchange bees, making the benefit mutual. I have done so, and considered myself well paid for the trouble, but latterly I have had several apiaries away from home, and now manage without difficulty. Advantages of making one good stock from two poor ones. This making one good stock out of two poor ones cannot be too highly recommended. Aside from its advantages, it relieves us from all disagreeable feelings in taking life that we can, with but little trouble, preserve. End of section 40, read by Sandra.
Section 41 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 21. Fall Management, Part 2. Two families together will not consume as much as if separate. Even when a stock already contains bees enough to make it safe for winter, another of the same number of bees may be added, and the consumption of honey will not be 5 pounds more than one swarm would consume alone. If they should be wintered in the cold, the difference might not be 1 pound. Why more bees do not consume a proportionate quantity of honey, which the experience of others as well as myself has thoroughly proved, is a mystery, unless the greater number of bees creates more animal heat, and being warm, eat less is a solution, which, if it is a strong reason for keeping bees warm in winter. An experiment. Notwithstanding all this, I cannot recommend making a good stock better by adding the bees from another good one as a source of profit. I tried it a few times. I had purchased some large hives for market, and wished to dispose of the bees without sulphur, and try the experiment of uniting 2 or more. The next spring, when they commenced work, such double stocks promised much. But when the swarming season arrived, the single swarms, such as were good, and had just about bees enough, were in the best condition in ordinary seasons. Whether this was owing to the circumstance of there being already bees enough that were beginning to crowd and interfere with each other's labours, and less brood raised in consequence, or to some other reason I cannot say. I have often noticed, as others have, that stocks which have cast no swarms are no better the next spring than others. The same cause might operate in both cases. Therefore it would appear unnecessary to unite 2 or more good swarms, unless it is to spare our feelings in destroying the bees. The 2 extremes may generally be avoided, and not have too many or too few bees. Season for operating. The season for operating is generally when all the brood has matured and left the cells. The exceptions are when there are not bees enough to protect the stores. It may then be necessary immediately after the failure of honey. Colonel H. K. Oliver of Salem, Mass., is said to be the inventor of the fumigator, an instrument to burn fungus, puffball. By the aid of this the smoke is blown in the hive, paralyzing the bees in a few minutes, when they fall to the bottom apparently dead, but will recover in a few minutes on receiving fresh air. The Fumigator. I am indebted to a communication from J. M. Weeks, published on page 151 of the Cultivator for 1841, for this method. The description of the fumigator that I constructed will vary a trifle from his, but will retain the principle. I obtained a tin tube 4 inches long and 2 in diameter. Next I made a stopper of soft wood 3 inches long to exactly fit one end of the tube when driven in 1/2 inch, and secured it by little nails driven through the tin. Through the center of this stopper I made a hole 1/4 inch in diameter. To prevent this hole filling up, the end in the tube was covered over with wire cloth made a little convex. The end of this stopper was cut down to about 1/2 inch, tapering it from the tin. For the other end a similar piece of wood is fitted, though a little longer and not to be fastened, as it must be taken out for every operation. The outer end of this is cut down into a shape to be taken into the mouth or attached to the pipe of a bellows. I fitted them in the turning lathe, but have seen them fixed very nicely without. It could all be made of tin, but then it is necessary to use solder, which is liable to melt and cause leaks. The puffballs must not be too much injured by remaining in the weather, and should be picked, if possible, just before they are ripe and burst open. When not thoroughly dry, put them in the oven after the bread is out. When used, the cuticle or rind must be carefully removed. Ignite it by a lamp or coal. It will not blaze in burning. Blow it and get it thoroughly started before putting it in the tube. Put in the stopper and blow through it. If it smokes well, you are ready to proceed. When it does not burn freely, unstop and shake it out. The dry air is much better than moist breath at the commencement. Directions for uniting 2 families. The hive to receive the bees is inverted, the other set over it right end up, all crevices stopped to prevent the escape of smoke. Now insert the end of the fumigator into a hole in the side of the hive, which, if not made before, will need to be now. Blow into the other end. This forces the smoke into the hive. In 2 minutes you may hear the bees begin to fall. Both hives should be smoked, the upper one the most, as we want all the bees out of that. The other only needs enough to make the scent of the bees similar to those introduced. At the end of 8 or 10 minutes, the upper hive may be raised, and any bees sticking between the combs brushed down with a quill. The 2 queens in this case are of course together. One will be destroyed and no difficulty arise. But if either of them is a young one, and you have been convinced by some bee doctor that such are much more prolific, and happen to know which hive contains her, and wish that one to be preserved, you can do so by varying the process a little. Instead of inverting one hive, set them both on a cloth right side up, and smoke the bees. The queens are easily found while they are all paralyzed. Then put the bees all together. The hive should now have a thin cloth tied over the bottom to prevent the escape of the bees. Before they are fully recovered, they seem rather bewildered, and some of them get away. Set the hive right end up, and raise it an inch. The bees drop on the cloth, and fresh air passing under soon revives them. In from 12 to 24 hours they may be let out. Families put together in this way will seldom quarrel, not more than 1 in 20, but remain together, defending themselves against intruders, as one swarm. I once had a stock nearly destitute of bees, with abundant stores for wintering a large family. I had let it down on the floorboard, and was on the lookout for an attack. The other bees soon discovered this weakness, and commenced carrying off the honey. I had brought home a swarm to reinforce them only the day before, and immediately united them by means of the fumigator. The next morning I let them out, allowing them to issue only at the hole at the side of the hive. It was amusing to witness the apparent consternation of the robbers that were on hand for more plunder. They had been there only the day before, and had been allowed to enter and depart without even being questioned. But lo! a change had come over the matter. Instead of open doors and a free passage, the first bee that touched the hive was seized and very rudely handled, and at last dispatched with a sting. A few others receiving similar treatment, they began to exercise a little caution, then tried to find admission on the back side and other places, and attempted 1 or 2 others on either side, perhaps thinking they were mistaken in the hive. But these, being strong, repulsed them, and they finally gave it up. I mention this to show how easy it is, with a little care, to prevent robberies at this season. Too many complaints are made about bees being robbed. It is very disagreeable. Suppose that none were plundered through carelessness. This complaint would soon be a rare thing. Uniting with tobacco smoke. By use of tobacco smoke, bees may be united with nearly the same success. First smoke the two to be united thoroughly. Disturb them and smoke again, that all may become partially drunk and acquire the same scent. Then invert both hives, and with your pruning tools cut the combs down on the sides of the hive and across the top, and take out one comb at a time with the bees on it, and brush them with a quill into the other hive. They immediately go down among the combs, without once thinking it necessary to sting you. When done, the bees are to be confined, the same as in the other method. I do not like this method as well as the first, and do not resort to it when I can get the puffball. The bees are more liable to disagree, and it compels me to take out the comb, which I do not always like to do at the time. To avoid it, I have tried to drive them, but when the hive is only part full of combs, or contains but few bees, it is a slow job, and more so in cool weather. Conditions of stocks in 1851. The latter part of the summer of 1851 was very dry and cold. The yield of buckwheat honey was not 1/10 of the usual quantity. The consequence was that none but early swarms had sufficient honey for winter. 25 pounds is required to make it safe in this section. I had over 30 young swarms with less than that quantity. Feeding for winter I avoid when I can. They would not winter as they were, and yet I made the most of them good stocks for the next summer by the following plan. How they were managed. I had about 20 old stocks with diseased brood, and but few bees, yet honey enough. Now this honey appears healthy enough for the old bees, and fatal only to the young brood. I transferred the bees of these new swarms to the old stocks with black comb and diseased brood. The bees were thus wintered on honey of but little account anyway, and all that was in the others, new and healthy, was saved. These new hives were set in a cold dry place for winter, right end up, to prevent much of the honey from dripping out of the cells. Some will leak then, but not as much as when the hive is bottom up. Honey that runs out when the hive is bottom up will soak into the wood at the base of the combs. This will have a tendency to loosen the fastenings, and render them liable to fall, etc. The next March the bees were again transferred from the old to the new hives. My method is as follows. As the combs in the hive to receive the bees are rather cold, I set them by the fire or in a warm room for several hours previous. I take a warm room before a window, and as some few bees fly off, they will collect there. The new hive is turned bottom up on the floor, the old one on a bench by the side of it, having smoked the bees to keep them quiet. One comb at a time is taken out, and the bees brushed into the new hive. A little smoke will keep them there. When through, I get the few on the window and tie over a cloth to confine them, and keep them warm for a few hours longer. Paralyzing with puffball will answer instead, but they do not always all fall out of the combs when the hive is filled to the bottom, and it is possible that if a few were left, the queen might be one. Also, a very few bees are worth saving at this season, and the combs might have to be broken out at last for this purpose. When a good-sized family is put in a hive containing 15 or 20 pounds of honey, and near half full of clean new comb, they are about as sure to fill up and cast a swarm as another that is full and has wintered a swarm. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Granville Penn. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 21, Fall Management, Part 3. Cause of their superior thrift. One cause of superior thrift may be found in the circumstance that all moth eggs and worms are frozen to death, and the bees are not troubled with a single worm before June. No young bees have to be removed to work them out. Nearly every young bee that is fed and sealed up comes forth perfect, and of course makes a vast difference in the increase. Swarms partly filled pay better than to cut out the honey. Any person wishing to increase his stocks to the utmost will find this plan of saving all part-filled hives of much more advantage than to break it out for sale. Suppose you have an old stock that needs pruning and have neglected it, or it has refused to swarm and give you a chance without destroying too much brood. You can let it be and put on the boxes, perhaps get 25 pounds of cap honey, and then winter the bees as described, and in the spring transfer them to the new combs. Again, if there is no stock to be transferred in the spring, keep them till the swarming season. If a swarm put into an empty hive would just fill it, the same swarm put into one containing 15 pounds of honey, it seems plain, would make that number of pounds in boxes. The advantage is in the comparative value of box or cap honey over that stored in the hive, the difference being from 30 to 100%. Advantages in transferring. I would now like to show the advantages I derived in transferring the 20 swarms before mentioned. We will suppose that each family, from the 1st of October till April, consumed 20 pounds of honey. That in the center combs, where there is most bee bread, etc., is eaten first. If any is left, it is at the top and outside. If I had attempted to take out and strain this 20 pounds in the fall, it would have been so mixed with dead brood and bee bread that I probably should have rejected most of it. The remainder, when strained, might have been 5 pounds, not more. The market price for it is about 10 cents per pound, amount 50 cents. We will say the new hive kept through the winter to receive the bees in the spring contained 15 pounds. This would also have averaged about 10 cents per pound, amounting to $1.50. All that a stock of this kind costs me appears to be just $2 and worth at least $5. The advantage in changing 20 would be $60. The labor of transferring will offset against the trouble of straining, preparing, and the expense of getting the honey to market. Another method of uniting two families. I have occasionally adopted yet another method of making a good stock from two poor ones, which the reader may prefer. When all your old stocks have been reinforced that need it, and you still have some swarms with too few bees and too little honey for safety as they are, two or more can be united. The fact, which has been thoroughly tested, that two families of bees, when united and wintered in one hive, will consume but little, if any more, than each of them would separately, is a very important principle in this matter. If each family should have 15 pounds of honey, they would consume it all and probably starve at last after eating 30 pounds. But if the contents of both were in one hive, it would be amply sufficient and some to spare in the spring. Uniting comb and honey as well as bees. The process of uniting them is simple. Smoke both the stocks or swarms thoroughly and turn them over. Choose the one with the straightest combs or the one nearest full to receive the contents of the other. Trim off the points of the combs to make them square across, and this one is ready. Remove the sticks from the other, and with your tools, take out the combs with the bees on as before directed, one at a time, and carefully place them on the edges of the other. If the shape will admit it, let the edges match. If not, let them cross. Small bits of wood or rolls of paper will be needed between them to preserve the right distance. When both hives are of one size, the transferred combs will exactly fit if you are careful to place them as they were before. You will now want to know what is to prevent these combs from falling out when the hive is turned over. This hive is to remain bottom up in some dark place for some time or till spring. See method of wintering bees. The bees will immediately join these combs fast. The hive being inverted, the honey in these combs will be consumed first, and when the hive is again set out in spring, it will be a rare occurrence for any pieces to drop out. Should any pieces project beyond the bottom of the hive, they may be trimmed off even after they are fastened any time before setting out. An additional cross stick may pass under the bottom of the combs to assist in holding them if you desire. You will probably never discover any difference in the subsequent prosperity and consequence of the joining or crossing of the combs in the middle. I have had them in this way when they were among the most prosperous of my stocks. As this operation is to be put off till November, it will be an advantage in another way. That is, families of the same apiary can be united and will mostly forget the old location by spring, and no difficulty arise by returning to the old stand, etc. When feeding should be done for stock hives. In some sections of country, the honey is more frequently wanting than bees or comb, and some seasons in this. In such cases, it will be found an advantage to feed until enough is stored for winter. This should be done in September or October. But if they lack comb as well as honey, and you wish to try feeding, which I seldom do lately, it should be done if possible in warm weather, as they cannot work combs to advantage in the cold. While feeding bees, it requires a great deal of caution to prevent others from scenting the honey and their contentions about it. The safest place is on top of the hive, with a good cap over, but they will not work quite as fast, especially if the weather is cool. The next best place is under the bottom, in the manner described in Chapter 9. Setting out honey to feed all at once, I condemn wholly. These disadvantages attend it. Strong stocks that do not need an ounce will get 2 or 3 pounds, while those weaker ones, needing it more, will not get 1. Nearly every stock, in a short time, will be fighting. Probably the first bee that comes home with a load will inform a number of its fellows that a treasure is close at hand. A number will sally out immediately without waiting for particular directions for finding it, and, mistaking other hives for the place, alight there, are seized and probably dispatched. As soon as the honey given them is gone, the tumult is greatly increased and great numbers are destroyed. If any of your neighbors near you have bees, you must expect to divide with them. If the honey to be fed is in the comb and your hives are not full and they are to be wintered in the house bottom up, it may be done at any time through the winter merely by laying pieces with honey on those in the hive. The bees readily remove the contents into their own combs. When empty, remove them and put in more until they have a full supply. They will join such pieces of comb to their own, yet there will be no harm in breaking them loose. The principal objection to feeding in this way will be found in the tendency to make them uneasy and disposed to leave the hive when we want them as quiet as possible. A thin muslin cloth or other means will be necessary to confine them to the hive. I have now given directions to avoid killing any family of bees worth saving if we choose. When such as need feeding have been fed, and all weak families made strong by additions, etc., but little more fall work is needed in the apiary. It is only when you have weak stocks unfit to winter that it is necessary to be on the lookout every warm day to prevent pillage. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 22. Wintering Bees, Part 1. There is almost as much diversity of opinion with respect to wintering bees as in the construction of hives, and about as difficult to reconcile. Different methods have been adopted. One will tell you to keep them warm, another to keep them cold, to keep them in the sun, out of the sun, bury them in the ground, put them in the cellar, the chamber, woodhouse, and other places, and no places at all, that is, to let them remain as they are, without any attention. Here are plans enough to drive the inexperienced into despair, yet I have no doubt but that bees have been sometimes successfully wintered by all these contradictory methods. That some of these methods are superior to others needs no argument to illustrate, but what method is best is our province to inquire. Let us endeavor to examine the subject without prejudice to bias our judgment. The idea of bees not freezing has led to errors in practice. By close observation, we shall probably discover that the assertion so often repeated, that bees have never frozen except when without honey, has led to an erroneous practice. Appearance of bees in cold weather. We will first endeavor to examine the condition of a stock left to nature, without any care, and see if it affords any hints for our guidance, when to assist and protect with artificial means. Warmth being the first requisite, a family of bees at the approach of cold weather crowd together in a globular form into a compass corresponding to the degree of cold. When at 0 it is much less than at 30 above. Those on the outside of this cluster are somewhat stiffened with cold, while those inside are as brisk and lively as in summer. In severe weather every possible space within their circle is occupied. Even each cell not containing pollen or honey will hold a bee. Suppose this cluster is sufficiently compact for mutual warmth, with the mercury at 40, and a sudden change brings it down to 0 in a few hours. This body of bees, like most other things, speedily contracts by the cold. The bees on the outside being already chilled, a portion of them that does not keep up with the shrinking mass is left exposed at a distance from their fellows, and receive but little benefit of the warmth generated there. They part with their vitality and are lost. How part of the swarm is frozen. A good family will form a ball or circle about 8 inches in diameter, generally about equal every way, and must occupy the spaces between 4 or 5 combs. As combs must separate them into divisions, the 2 outer ones are smallest and most exposed of any. These are often found frozen to death in severe weather. Should evidence be wanting from other sources to show that bees will freeze to death, the above would seem to furnish it. It is said, that in Poland bees are wintered in a semi-torpid state in consequence of the extreme cold. We must either doubt the correctness of this relation or suppose that bee of that country a different insect from ours, a kind of semi-wasp that will live through the winter and eat little or nothing. The reader can have no difficulty in deciding which is the most probable, whether bees are bees throughout the world, endowed with the same faculties and instincts, or that the facts as they are not precisely given, especially when we see what our own apiarians tell us about their never freezing. Here I might use strong language in contradiction, but as I am aware that such a course is not always the most convincing, I prefer the test of close observation. If bees will freeze, it is important to know it, and in what circumstances. How a small family may all freeze. Suppose a quart of bees were put in a box or hive where all the cells were filled and lengthened out with honey. The spaces between the combs would be about 1/4 of an inch, only room for one thickness of bees to spread through. The combs would perhaps be 1½ or 2 inches thick. All the warmth that could be generated then would be by one course or layer of bees 1½ inch apart. Although every bee would have food in abundance without changing its position, the first turn of severe weather would probably destroy the whole. This, it may be said, is an unnatural situation. I will admit that it is. The case was only supposed for illustration. I know that their winter quarters are among the brood combs, where the hatching of the brood leaves most of the cells empty, and the space between the combs is 1/2 inch, a wise and beautiful arrangement, as 10 times the number of bees can pack themselves within a circle of 6 inches as can in the other case, and in consequence the same number of bees can secure much more animal heat and endure the cold much better. But a small family, even here, will often be found frozen as well as starving. Frost and ice sometimes smother bees. Besides freezing, there are other facts to be observed in stocks which stand in the cold. If we examine the interior of a hive containing a medium-sized swarm on the first severely cold morning, except in the immediate vicinity of the bees, we shall find the combs and sides of the hive covered with a white frost. In the middle of the day, or as soon as the temperature is slightly raised, this begins to melt, first next to the bees, then at the sides. A succession of cold nights will prevent the evaporation of this moisture, and this process of freezing and thawing at the end of a week or two will form icicles, sometimes as large as a man's finger, attached to the combs and the sides of the hive. When the bottom of the hive is close to the floor, it forms a ceiling around the edges, perfectly airtight, and your bees are smothered. I have frequently heard beekeepers say in these cases, quote, "The storm blew in and formed ice all round the bottom and froze my bees to death." End quote. Others that have had their bees in a cold room, finding them thus, quote, "could not see how the water and ice could get there any way, were quite sure it was not there when we carried in," end quote, etc. Probably they never dreamed of its being accounted for philosophically, and to analyze anything pertaining to bees would be rather small business. But what way can it be accounted for? Frost and ice in a hive accounted for. Physiologists tell us, quote, that innumerable pores in the cuticle of the human body are continually throwing off waste or worn-out matter, that every exhalation of air carries with it a portion of water from the system, in warm weather unperceived, but will be condensed into particles large enough to be seen in cold atmosphere. End quote. Now, if analogy be allowed here, we will say the bee throws off waste matter and water in the same way. Its food being liquid, nearly all will be exhaled. In moderate weather it will pass off, but in the cold it is condensed. The particles lodge on the combs in the form of frost, and accumulate as long as the weather is very severe, a portion melting in the day and freezing again at night. The effect of ice or frost on bees and comb. When the bees are not smothered, this water in the hive is the source of other mischief. The combs are quite certain to mold. The water mold or dampness on the honey renders it thin and unhealthy for the bees, causing dysentery or the accumulation of feces that they are unable to retain. When the hive contains a very large family, or a very small one, there will be less frost on the combs. The animal heat of the first will drive it off. In the latter there will be but little exhaled. Frost may cause starvation. This frost is frequently the cause of medium or small families starving in cold weather, even when there is plenty of honey in the hive. Suppose all the honey in the immediate vicinity of the cluster of bees is exhausted, and the combs in every direction from it are covered with frost. If a bee should leave the mass and venture among them for a supply, its fate would be as certain as starvation, and without timely intervention of warmer weather, they must perish. Other difficulties. Should they escape starving, there is another difficulty often attending them in continued cold weather. I said that small families exhaled but little. Let us see if we can explain the effect. There is not sufficient animal heat generated to exhale the aqueous portion of their food. The philosophy that explains why a man in warm blood and in profuse perspiration would throw off or exhale more moisture than in a quiet state will illustrate this. The bees in these circumstances must retain the water with the excrementitious part, which soon distends their bodies to the utmost, rendering them unable to endure it long. Their cleanly habits, that ordinarily save the combs from being soiled, is not a sure protection now, and they are compelled to leave the mass very often in the severest weather to expel this unnatural accumulation of feces. It is frequently discharged even before leaving the comb, but most of it at the entrance. Also some scattered on the front side of the hive and a short distance from it. In a moderately warm day more bees will issue from a hive in this condition than from others. It appears that a part of them are unable to discharge their burden, their weight prevents their flying, they get down and are lost. When cold weather is too long continued, they cannot wait for warm days to leave, but continue to come out at any time, and not one of such can then return. The cluster inside the hive is thus reduced in numbers till they are unable to generate heat sufficient to keep from freezing. With the indications attendant upon such losses, my own observation has made me somewhat familiar, as the following conversation will illustrate. End of section 43. Read by Sandra near Montreal, 2022. Section 44 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 22. Wintering Bees, Part 2. Further illustrations. A neighbor who wished to purchase some stock hives in the fall requested my assistance in selecting them. We applied to a perfect stranger. His bees had passed the previous winter in the open air. I found on looking among them that he had lost some of them from this cause, as the excrement was yet about the entrance of one old weather-beaten hive that was now occupied by a young swarm and was about half filled with combs. I saw at once what had been the matter, and felt quite confident that I could give its owner a correct history of it. "Sir," said I, "you have been unfortunate with the bees that were in this hive last winter. I think I can give you some particulars respecting it." "Ah, what makes you think so? I would like to hear you guess. To encourage you, I will admit that there has been something rather peculiar about it. 1 year ago you considered that a good stock hive. It was well filled with honey, a good family of bees, and 2 or 3 years old or more. You had as much confidence in its wintering as any other. But during the cold weather, somehow, the bees unaccountably disappeared, leaving but a very few, and they were found frozen to death. You discovered it towards spring on a warm day. When you removed the combs, you probably noticed a great many spots of excrement deposited on them, as well as on the sides of the hive, particularly near the entrance. Also 1/2 or more of the breeding cells contained dead brood in a putrid state, and this summer you have used the old hive for a new swarm." "You are right, sir, in every particular. Now I would like to know what gave you the idea of my losing the bees in that hive. I can see nothing peculiar about that old hive more than this one," pointing to another that also contained a new swarm. "You will greatly oblige me if you will point out the signs particularly." "I will do so with pleasure," feeling quite willing to give him the impression that I was posted up on this subject, notwithstanding it savoured strongly of boasting. I then directed his attention to the entrance in the side of the hive where the bees had discharged their feces on the moment they issued, until it was near the 1/8 of an inch thick and 2 or 3 inches broad. That yet remained and just began to cleave off. You see this brown substance around this hole in the hive? Yes, it is bee glue, propolis. It is very common on old hives. I think not. If you will examine it closely, you will perceive it is not so hard and bright. It already begins to crumble. Bee glue is not affected by the weather for years. Just so, but what is it? And what has that to do with your guesswork? It is the excrement of the bees. In consequence of a great many cells containing dead brood, which the bees could not enter, They were unable to pack themselves close enough to secure sufficient animal heat to exhale or drive off the water in their food. It was therefore retained in their bodies until they were distended beyond endurance. They were unable to wait for a warm day. Necessity compelled them to issue daily during the coldest weather, discharging their feces the moment of passing the entrance, and part of them before. They were immediately chilled and could not return. The quantity left about this entrance shows that a great many must have come out. That they came out in cold weather is proved by its being left on the hive, because in warm weather they leave the hive for this purpose. This is a new idea. At present it seems to be correct. I will think it over. But how did you know that it was not a new swarm, that it was well filled? When looking under it just now, I saw that combs of a dark color had been attached to the sides near the bottom, below where those are at present. This indicates that it had been full, and the dark color that it was not new. Also, a swarm early and large enough to fill such a hive the first season would not be very likely to be affected by the cold in this way. Why not? I think this hive was crowded with bees as much as any of my new swarms. I have no doubt they appeared so, but we are very liable to be deceived in such cases by the dead brood in the combs. A moderate-sized family in such a hive will make more show than some larger ones that have empty cells to creep into and can pack closer. But how did you know about the dead brood? Because old stocks are thus often reduced and lost. What were the indications of it being filled with honey? Combs are seldom attached to the side of the hive farther down than they are filled with honey. In this hive the combs had been attached to the bottom, consequently must have been full. Another thing, unless the family is very much reduced, the hive is generally well stored, even when diseased. Why did you suppose it was near spring before I discovered it? I took the chances of guessing. The majority of beekeepers, you know, are rather careless, and when they have fixed their bees for winter seldom give them much more attention till they begin to fly out in the spring. But what should I have done had I discovered the bees coming out? As it was affected with dead brood, it was but little use to do anything. You would have lost it eventually. But if it had been a stock otherwise healthy and was affected in this way only because it was a small family, or the severity of the weather, you could have taken it to a warm room and turned it bottom up. The animal heat would then convert the most of the water contained in their food into vapor. That would rise from the hive, and the bees could retain the excrementitious portion without difficulty till spring. I suppose you must get along without losing many through the winter, if I may judge by your confident explanations. I can assure you I have but little fear on this head. If I can have the privilege of selecting proper stocks, I will engage not to lose 1 in 100. How do you manage? I would be glad to obtain a method in which I could feel as perfectly safe as you appear to. The first important requisite is to have all good ones to start with. Enough weak families are united together till they're strong, or some other disposition made of them. I then gave him an outline of my method of wintering, which I can confidently recommend to the reader. Accumulation of feces described by some writers as a disease. This accumulation of feces is considered by many writers as a disease, a kind of dysentery. It is described as affecting them towards spring, and several remedies are given. Now, if what I've been describing is not the dysentery, why, I must think I never had a case of it. But I shall persist in guessing it to be the same, and suppose that inattention with many must be the reason that it is not discovered in cold weather at the time that it takes place. Some stocks may be badly affected, yet not lost entirely, when moderate weather will stop its progress. When a remedy is applied in the spring, long after the cause ceases to operate, it would be singular if it was not effectual. I have no doubt but some have taken the natural discharge of feces that always takes place in spring when the bees leave the hive, for a disease. Others, when looking for a cause for diseased brood, and found the combs and hive somewhat besmeared, have assigned this as sufficient, but according to my view have reversed it, giving the effect before the cause. The author's remedy. For a time I supposed that this moisture on the combs gradually mixed with the honey, making it thin, and that the bees, eating so much water with their food, would affect them as described. Some experiments that followed induced me to assign cold as the cause, as I always found, when I put them where it was sufficiently warm, that an immediate cure was the result, or at least It enabled them to retain their feces till set out in the spring. Burying bees. Burying bees in the earth below the frost has been recommended as a superior method of wintering for small families. I have known it confidently asserted that they would lose nothing in weight and no bees would die. I found in testing it that a medium quantity of honey sufficed, but very few were lost, perhaps less than by any other method. Yet the combs were mouldy and unfit for further use. There was no escape for the vapor and dampness of the earth. This did not satisfy me. It only cured one disease by instituting another. I saved the bees and perhaps some honey, but the combs were spoiled. Experiments of the author to get rid of the frost. I wished to keep them warm and save the bees as well as honey, and at the same time get rid of the moisture. I found that a large family expelled it much better than small ones, and if all were put together in a close room, the animal heat from a large number combined would be an advantage to the weak ones at least. This proved of some benefit, yet I found on the sides of a glass hive that large drops of water would stand for weeks. Success in this matter. The following suggestion then came to my relief. If this hive was bottom up, what would prevent all this vapor, as it arises from the bees, from passing off? It always rises when warm, if permitted. The hive was inverted. In a few hours the glass was dry. This was so perfectly simple that I wondered I had not thought of it before, and wondered still more that some one of the many intelligent apiarians had never discovered it. I immediately inverted every hive in the room, and kept them in this way till spring, when the combs were perfectly bright, not a particle of mold to be seen, and was well satisfied with the result of my experiment, although I was fearful that more bees would leave the hives when inverted than if right side up, yet the result showed no difference. I had now tried both methods, and had some means of judging. End of section 44. Read by Sandra. Section 45 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 22. Wintering Bees. Part 3. Bees, when in the house, should be kept perfectly dark. When not kept perfectly dark, a few would leave the hives in either case. I have found it much better to make the room dark to keep the bees in the hive than to tie over them a thin muslin cloth, as that prevents a free passage of the vapor, and a great number of full stocks were not at all satisfied in confinement, and were continually worrying and biting at the cloth till they had made several holes through it for passages out. Thus the little good was attended by an evil as an offset. Even wire cloth put over to confine them, which would be effectual, would not save bees enough to pay expense. I have thus wintered them for the last 10 years, and am extremely doubtful if a better way can be found. For several years I made use of a small bedroom in the house made perfectly dark, in which I put about 100 stocks. It was lathed and plastered, and no air admitted except what might come through the floor. It was single and laid rather close, though not matched. A room made for wintering bees. In the fall of 1849 I built a room for this purpose. The frame was 8 by 16 feet square and 7 high, without any windows. A good coat of plaster was put on the inside. A space of 4 inches between the siding and lath was filled with sawdust. Under the bottom I constructed a passage for the admission of air from the north side, another overhead for its exit, to be closed and opened at pleasure, in moderate weather, to give them fresh air, but closed when cold, and so arranged as to exclude all the light. A partition was extended across near the center. This was to prevent disturbing the whole by letting in light when carrying them out in the spring. By closing the door of this partition, those in one room only need be disturbed at once. Manner of stowing away bees. Shelves to receive the hives were arranged in tiers, one above the other. They were loose, to be taken down and put up at pleasure. Suppose we begin at the back end. The first row is turned directly on the floor. A shelf is then put across a few inches above them and filled, then another shelf still above when we begin again on the floor. and continue thus till the room is full, or if the room is not to be filled, the shelves may be fixed around the sides of the room in 2 or 3 courses. This last arrangement will make it very convenient to inspect them at any time through the winter, yet they should be disturbed as little as possible. The manner of stowing each one is to open the holes in the top, then lay down 2 square sticks, such as are made by splitting a board of suitable length, into pieces about 1 inch wide. The hive is inverted on these. It gives a free circulation through the hive and carries off all the moisture as fast as generated. Temperature of the room. The temperature of such a room will vary according to the number and strength of the stocks put in. 100 or more would be very sure to keep it above the freezing point at all times. Putting a very few into such a room and depending on the bees to make it warm enough would be of doubtful utility. If these means will not keep the proper temperature, probably some other method would be better. All full stocks would do well enough, as they would almost any way. Yet I shall recommend housing them whenever practicable. If the number of stocks is few, let the room be proportionately small. It is the smallest families that are most trouble, for if they're too cold, it may be known by bees leaving the hive in cold weather, and spots of excrement on the combs. They should then have some additional protection. Close part or all of the holes in the top, cover the open bottom partially or wholly, and confine to the hive as much as possible the animal heat. When these means fail, it may be necessary to take them to a warm room during the coldest weather. Too much honey may sometimes be stored. After the flowers fail and all the brood has matured and left the combs, it sometimes happens that a stock has an opportunity of plundering and rapidly filling all those cells that had been occupied with brood during the yield of honey, and which then effectually prevents their storing in them. This then prevents close packing, which is all important for warmth, although a large family as much care is needed as with the smaller ones. Also, such as are affected with diseased brood should receive extra attention for the same reason. Some beekeepers are unwilling to risk the bold measure of inverting the hive, but content themselves by merely opening the holes in the top. This is better than no ventilation, but not so effectual, as all of the moisture cannot escape. There are some who cannot divest themselves of the idea that if the hive is turned over, the bees must also stand on their heads all winter. Rats and mice, when they find their way into such a room, are less bold with their mischief than if the hive is in its natural position. Management of room towards spring. A few warm days will often occur towards spring before we can get our bees out. In these cases, a bushel or 2 of snow or ice, pounded up, should be spread on the floor. It will absorb and carry off as it melts much of the heat that is now unnecessary, and will keep them quiet much longer than without it. Provision for getting rid of this water should be made when putting down the floor. Time for setting out bees. The time for carrying out bees is generally in March, but some seasons later. A warm, pleasant day is the best, and one quite cold better than one only moderately warm. After their long confinement, the light attracts them out at once, unless very cold air prevents, and if the rays of a warm sun do not keep them active, they will soon be chilled and lost. Some beekeepers take out their stocks at evening. If we could be always sure of having the next day a fair one, it would probably be the best time, but should it be only moderate or cloudy, it would be attended with considerable loss, or if the next day should be quite cold, but few would leave, and then the only risk would be to get a good day before one that was just warm enough to make them leave the hive, but not quite enough to enable them to return. Not too many stocks taken out at once. When too many are taken out at once, the rush from all the hives is so much like a swarm that it appears to confuse them. Some of the stocks by this means will get more bees than actually belong to them, while others are proportionably short, which is unprofitable, and to equalize them is some trouble, yet it may be done. Being all wintered in one room, the scent or the means of distinguishing their own family from strangers becomes so much alike that they mix together without contention. Families may be equalized. By taking advantage of this immediately, or before the scent has changed again, and each hive has something peculiar to itself, you can change the stands of very weak and very strong families. To prevent as far as possible some of these bad effects, I prefer waiting for a fair day to begin, and then not until the day has become sufficiently warm to make it safe from chill. Snow need not always prevent carrying out bees. I am not particular about the snow being gone. If it has only lain long enough to have melted a part of it, it is terra firma to a bee, and answers equally well as the bare earth. When the day is right, about 10 o'clock, I put out 12 or 15, taking care that each hive occupies its old stand, at the same time endeavoring to take such as will be as far apart as possible. To make this convenient, they should be carried in the manner that you wish them to come out. When the rush from these hives is over, and the majority of the bees has gone back, I set out as many more about 12 o'clock, and when the day continues fair, another lot about 2. In the morning, while cool, I move from the back to the first apartment, about as many as I wish to set out in a day, except a few at the last. To do this in the middle of the day while warm would induce a good many bees to leave the hive while the light was admitted, and which would be lost. It will be supposed generally that their long confinement makes them thus impatient to get out, but I have frequently returned stocks during a cold turn of weather, after which they had been out, and always found such equally as anxious to come out as those which had been confined throughout the winter. Without the airings, I've kept them thus confined for 5 months without difficulty. The important requisites are sufficient warmth and perfect darkness. End of section 45. Read by Sandra. Section 46 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 22. Wintering Bees, Part 4. Does not analogy prove that bees should be kept warm in winter? Opposition to this method of wintering will arise with those who have always thought that bees must be kept cold. The colder the better. I would suggest for their consideration the possibility of some analogy between bees and some of the warm-blooded animals, the horse, ox, and sheep, for instance, that require a constant supply of food, that they may generate as much caloric as is thrown off on the cold air. This seems to be regulated by the degree of cold, else why do they refuse the large quantity of tempting provender in the warm days of spring, and greedily devour it in the pelting storm? The fact is pretty well demonstrated that the quantity of food needed for the same condition in spring is much less when protected from the inclemency of the weather than when exposed to the severe cold. The bee, unlike the wasp, when once penetrated with frost, is dead. Their temperature must be kept considerably above the freezing point, and to do this food is required. Now, if the bees are governed by the same laws, and cold air carries off more heat than warm, and their source of renewing it is in the consumption of honey in proportion to the degree of cold, common sense would say, keep them warm as possible. As a certain degree of heat is necessary in all stocks, it may take about such a quantity of honey to produce it, and this may explain why a small family requires about the same amount of food as others that are very large. The next best place for wintering bees. A dry, warm cellar is the next best place for wintering them. The apiarian, having one perfectly dark, with room to spare, will find it a very good place in the absence of a room above ground. If a large number was put in, some means of ventilation should be contrived for warm turns of weather. I know an apiarian who, by my suggestion, has wintered from 60 to 80 stocks in this way for the last 6 years, with perfect success, not having lost one. Another has wintered 30 with equal safety. As for burying them in the earth, I have not the least doubt if a dry place should be selected, the hive inverted and surrounded with hay, straw, or some substance to absorb the moisture, and protected from the rain at the top of the covering, that perfect success would attend the experiment. But this is only a theory. When I tried the experiment of burying and had the combs mold, the hives were right side up. Evils of winterings in the open air considered. As a great many beekeepers will find it inconvenient or be unable to avail themselves of my method of wintering, it will be well enough to see how far the evils of the open air, which we have already glanced at, may be successfully avoided. I am told by those who have tried wintering them in straw hives that in this respect they are much safer than those made of boards. Probably the straw will absorb the moisture, but as these hives are more trouble to construct and their shape will prevent the use of suitable boxes for surplus honey, this one advantage will hardly balance the loss. They are said also to be more liable to injury from the moth. We want a hive that will unite advantageously as many points as possible. It should be remembered that bees always need air, especially in the cold. With this in view, we will try to dispose of the vapor or frost. If the hive is raised sufficient to let it out, it will let in the mice, to prevent which it should be raised only about 1/4 of an inch. The hole in the side should be nearly covered with wire cloth to keep out the mice, but give a passage for the bees, otherwise they collect there, endeavoring to get out, and remain till chilled, and thus perish by hundreds. The boxes on the top must be removed, but not the cap or cover, the holes all opened to let the vapor pass up into the chamber. If this is made with perfectly close joints, so that no air escapes, it should be raised a very little, otherwise not. The moisture will condense on the sides and top. When it melts, will follow the sides to the bottom and pass out. The rabbiting about the top of the hive will prevent its getting to the holes and down among the bees. It will be easily comprehended that a hole between each 2 combs at the top, as mentioned in the subject of putting on the boxes, will ventilate the hive much better than where there is but 1 or 2, or where there is a row of several and all are between 2 combs. But little risk with good stocks. All good stocks may be wintered in this way, with but little risk in most situations. Whether in the bleak north wind, buried in a snowbank, or situated warm and pleasant, it will make no great difference. The mice cannot enter, the holes give them air and carry off moisture, etc. But second-rate stocks are not equally safe in cold situations. Effect of keeping second-rate stocks out of the sun. It has been strongly urged, without regard to the strength of the stock, to keep them all out of the sun, because an occasional warm day would call out the bees when they get on the snow and perish. This is a loss, to be sure, but there is such a thing as inducing a greater one by endeavoring to avoid this. I have said in another place that second-rate or poor stocks might occasionally starve with plenty of stores in the hive on account of frosty combs. If the hive is kept from the sun in the cold, the periods of temperate weather might not occur as often, as the bees would exhaust the honey within their circle or cluster. But on the contrary, when the sun can strike the hive, it warms up the bees and melts the frost more frequently. The bees may then go among their stores and obtain a supply generally as often as needed. We seldom have a winter without sunny days enough for this purpose, but should such an one occur, stocks of this class should be brought into a warm room once in 4 or 5 days, for a few hours at a time, to give them a chance to get at the honey. Stocks much below second rate cannot be wintered successfully in this climate. The only place for them is the warm room. I have known bees thoroughly covered in a snowdrift, and their owner was at considerable trouble to shovel the snow away, fearing it would smother them. This is unnecessary. When protected from the mice and ventilated as just directed, a snowbank is about as comfortable a place as they can have, except in the house. When examined a short time after being so covered, the snow for a space of about 4 inches on every side of the hive is found melted, and none but quite poor stocks would be likely to suffer with this protection. A little snow around the bottom, without a vent in the side of the hive, might smother them. Effects of snow considered. As for the bees getting on the snow, I apprehend that not many more are lost there than on the frozen earth, that is, the same kind of weather. I have seen them chilled and lost on the ground by hundreds, when a casual observer would not have noticed them, whereas had they been on the snow at the distance of several rods, every bee would have been conspicuous. Snow is not to be dreaded as much as chilly air. Suppose a hive stands in the sun throughout the winter, and bees are allowed to leave when they choose, and a portion are lost on the snow, and that it was possible to number all that were lost by getting chilled throughout the season on the bare earth. The proportion, in my opinion, lost on the snow would not be 1 in 20. A person that has not closely observed during damp or chilly weather in April, May, or even the summer months, has no adequate conception of the number. Yet I do not wish to be understood that it is of no consequence what are lost on the snow by any means. On the contrary, a great many are lost that might be saved with proper care. But I would like to impress the fact that frozen earth is not safe without warm air, any more than snow when crusted or a little hard. Even when snow is melting, it is solid footing for a bee. They can and do rise from it with the same ease as from the earth. Bees that perish on snow in these circumstances would be likely to be lost if there was none. Stocks to be protected on some occasions. The worst time for them to leave the hive is immediately after a new snow has fallen, because if they light on it then, it does not sustain their weight, and they soon work themselves down out of the rays of the sun and perish. Should it clear off pleasant after a storm of this kind, a little attention would probably be remunerated. Also, when the weather is moderately warm, and not sufficiently so to be safe, they should be kept in, whether snow is on the ground or otherwise. For this purpose, a wide board should be set up before the hive to protect it from the sun, at least above the entrance in the side. But if it grows sufficiently warm so that bees leave the hive when so shaded, it is a fair test by which to tell when it will do to let them have a good chance to sally out freely, except in cases of a new snow, when it is advisable to confine them to the hive. The hive might be let down on the floorboard, and the wire cloth cover the passage in the side, and made dark for the present, raising the hive at night again as before. I have known hundreds of stocks wintered successfully without any such care being taken, and the bees allowed to come out whenever they chose to do so, their subsequent health and prosperity proving that it is not altogether ruinous. It has been recommended to enclose the whole hive by a large box set over it and made perfectly dark with means for ventilation, etc. A snowbank would answer equally well, if not better. For large families it will do well enough, as would also other methods, but I would much rather take the chances of letting them all stand in the sun and issue as they please, than to have the warmth of the sun entirely excluded from the moderate-sized families. I never knew a whole stock lost by this cause alone. Yet I have known a great many starved, merely because the sun was not allowed to melt the frost on the combs and give them a chance to get at their stores. Do the bees eat more when allowed to come out occasionally in winter? Besides the loss of bees on the snow when standing in the sun and taking an airing occasionally, there are some economical beekeepers who urge this disadvantage, that every time bees come out in winter they discharge their excrement and eat more honey in consequence of the vacant room. What a ridiculous absurdity it would be to apply this principle to the horse, whose health, strength, and vital heat is sustained by the assimilation of food, and the farmer is not to be found who would think of saving his provender by the same means. That bees are supported in cold weather on the same principle is indicated strongly, if not conclusively. Is it not better, if what has been said on the subject of wintering bees is correct, to keep our bees warm and comfortable when practicable as a means of saving honey? To winter bees in the best manner, considerable care is required. Whenever you are disposed to neglect them, you should bear in mind that one early swarm is worth 2 late ones. Their condition in spring will often decide this point. Like a team of cattle or horses when well wintered, they are ready for a good season's work, but when poorly wintered, have to recruit a long time before they're worth much. End of section 46. Read by Sandra.
Section 47 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 23. Sagacity of Bees. Are not bees directed alone by instinct? On this subject I have but little to say, as I have failed to discover anything uncommonly remarkable, separate and distinct in one swarm, that another would not exhibit. I have found one swarm guided alone by instinct, doing just what another would under the same circumstances. Writers, not contented with the astonishing results of instinct, with their love of the marvelous, must add a good share of reason to their other faculties, an adaptation of means to ends that reason alone could produce. It is very true, without close inspection, and comparing the results of different swarms in similar cases, one might arrive at such conclusion. It is difficult, as all will admit, to tell where instinct ends and reason begins. Instances of sagacity like the following have been mentioned. When the weather is warm and the heat inside is somewhat oppressive, a number of bees may be seen stationed around the entrance, vibrating their wings. Those inside will turn their heads towards the passage, while those outside will turn theirs the other way. A constant agitation of air is thus created, thereby ventilating the hive more effectually. All full stocks do this in hot weather. What they do with propolis. A snail had entered the hive and fixed itself against the glass side. The bees, unable to penetrate it with their stings, the cunning economists fixed it immovably by cementing merely the edge of the orifice of the shell to the glass with resin, propolis, and thus it became a prisoner for life. Now, the instinct that prompts the gathering of propolis in August and filling every crack, flaw, or inequality about the hive would cement the edges of the snail shell to the glass, and a small stone, block of wood, chip, or any substance that they are unable to remove would be fastened with it in the same manner. The edges or bottom of the hive, when in close proximity to the bottom, is joined to it with this substance. Whatever the obstacle may be, it is pretty sure to receive a coating of this. The stoppers for the holes at the top are held in their places on the same principle, and the unaccountable sagacity that once fastened a little door might possibly be nothing more than the same instinct. Another principle, I think, will be found to be universal with them, instead of sagacious reasoning. Whenever the combs in a hive have been broken, or when combs have been added, as was mentioned in the chapter on fall management, the first duty of the bees appears to be to fasten them as they are. When the edges are near the side of the hive, or two combs in contact, a portion of wax is detached and used for joining them together, or to the side. Mending broken combs. Where two combs do not touch, and yet are close together, a small bar is constructed from one to the other, preventing any nearer approach. This may be illustrated by turning the hive a few inches from the perpendicular after being filled with combs in warm weather. Making passages to every part of their combs. Should nearly all the combs in the hive become detached from any cause, and lie on the bottom in one grand smash of ruin, their first steps are, as just described, pillars from one to the other to keep them as they are. In a few days, in warm weather, they will have made passages by biting away combs where they are in contact throughout every part of the mass, little columns of wax below, supporting the combs above. Irregular, to be sure, but as well as circumstances admit. Not a single piece can be removed without breaking it from the others, and the whole will be firmly cemented together. A piece of comb filled with honey and sealed up may be put in a glass box with the ends of these cells so sealed, touching the glass. The principle of allowing no part of their tenement to be in a situation inaccessible is soon manifested. They immediately bite off the ends of the cells, remove the honey that is in the way, and make a passage next to the glass, leaving a few bars from it to the comb to steady and keep it in its position. A single sheet of comb lying flat on the bottom board of a populous swarm is cut away underside, for a passage in every direction, numerous little pillars of wax being left for its support. How any person in the habit of watching their proceedings, with any degree of attention, could come at the conclusion that the bees raised such comb by mechanical means, and then put under the props for its support, is somewhat singular. Their efforts united for such a purpose, like reasonable beings, I never witnessed. These things, considered as the effect of instinct, are none the less wonderful on that account. I am not sure but the display of wisdom is even greater than if the power of planning their own operations had been given them. I have mentioned these to show that a course of action called forth by the peculiar situation of one family would be copied by another in a similar emergency, without being aware of its ever being done before. Were I engaged in a work of fiction, I might let fancy reign and endeavor to amuse, but this is not the object. Let us endeavor, then, to be content with truth, and not murmur with its reality. When we take a survey of the astonishing regularity with which they construct their combs without a teacher, and remember that the waxen material is formed in the rings of their body, that for the first time in life, without an experienced leader's direction, they apply a claw to detach it, that they go forth to the fields and gather stores unbidden by a tyrant's mandate, and throughout the whole cycle of their operations, one law and power governs. Whoever would seek mind as the directing power must look beyond the sensorium of the bee for the source of all we behold in them. End of Chapter 23. Recording by Louise J. Belle. Sebastopol, California.
Chapter 24 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Straining honey and wax. Straining honey and wax. When about to remove the contents of a hive, I have never found it necessary to use all the precautions often recommended to prevent the access of bees. I have seen it stated that a room in which there was a chimney open would be unsuitable, as the bees would scent the honey, and thus find their way down into the room. I never was thus troubled by their perpendicular traveling. It is true. If the day was warm and a door or window was standing open, the bees would find their way in during a scarcity of honey. But with doors and windows closed, no difficulty need be apprehended. Methods of removing combs from the hive. The most convenient way to remove combs from the hive is to take off one of its sides, but this is apt to split the boards, if it was properly nailed, and injure it for the subsequent use. With tools such as have been described, it may be done very nicely, and leave the hive whole. The chisel should have the bevel all on one side, like those used by carpenters. When you commence, turn the flat side next the board of the hive, and the bevel crowded by the combs will follow it close the whole length. With the other tool there, cut across the top, and readily lift it out. If preferred, they may be cut across near the center and take out half a sheet at a time. This is sometimes necessary on account of the cross sticks. Different methods of straining honey. Such combs as are taken from the middle or vicinity of brood cells are generally unfit for the table. Such should be strained. There are several methods of doing it. One is to mash the comb and put it in a bag, and hang it over some vessel to catch the honey as it drains out. This will do very well for small quantities in warm weather, or in the fall before there is any of it candied. Another method is to put such combs into a colander, and set this over a pan, and introduce it into an oven after the bread is out. This melts the combs. The honey and a portion of the wax run out together. The wax rises to the top and cools in a cake. It is somewhat liable to burn, and requires some care. Many prefer this method, as there is less taste of bee bread, no cells containing it being disturbed, but all the honey is not certain to drain out without stirring it. If disposed, two qualities may be made, by keeping the first separate. Another method is merely to break the combs finely, and put them into a colander, and allow the honey to drain out without much heat, and afterwards skim off the small particles that rise to the top, or when very particular, pass the honey through a cloth or piece of lace. But for large quantities, a more expeditious mode is to have a can and strainer, made for the purpose, where 50 pounds or more can be worked out at once. The can is made of tin, 12 or 14 inches deep, by about 10 or 12 diameter, with handles on each side at the top, for lifting it. The strainer is just enough smaller to go down inside the can. The height may be considerably less, providing there are handles on each side to pass out at the top. The bottom is perforated with holes like a colander. Combs are put into this, and the whole set into a kettle of boiling water, and heated without any risk of burning, until all wax is melted, which may be ascertained by stirring it, when it may be taken out. All the wax, bee bread, and etc. will rise in a few minutes. The strainer can now be raised out of the top and set on a frame for the purpose, or by merely tipping it slightly on one side it will rest on the top of the can. It might be left to cool before raising the strainer, were it not liable to stick to the sides of the can. The honey would be full as pure, and separate nearly as clean from the wax and bee bread, and etc. When raised out before cooling, the contents should be repeatedly stirred, or considerable honey will remain. Two qualities may be made by keeping the first that runs through separate from the last, as stirring it works out the bee bread. Even a third quality may be obtained by adding a little water and repeating the process. This is worth but little. By boiling out the water without burning and removing the scum, it will do to feed bees. By adding water until it will just bear a potato, boiling and skimming and letting it ferment, it will make metheglin, or by letting the fermentation proceed it will make vinegar. Honey that has been heated thoroughly will not candy as readily as when strained without heat. A little water may be added to prevent its getting too hard, but should it get so in cold weather, it can at any time be warmed, and water added until it is of the right consistence. Getting out wax, different methods. Several methods have been adopted for separating the wax. I never found any means of getting out the whole, yet I suppose I came as near it as anyone. Some recommend heating it in an oven, similar to the method of straining honey through the colander, but I have found it to waste more than when melted with water. A better way for small quantities is to half fill a coarse stout bag with refuse comb and a few cobblestones to sink it, and boil it in a kettle of water, pressing and turning it frequently till the wax ceases to rise. When the contents of the bag are emptied, by squeezing a handful the particles of wax may be seen, and you may thereby judge of the quantity thrown away. For large quantities, the foregoing process is rather tedious. It can be facilitated by having two levers 4 or 5 feet long, and about 4 inches wide, and fastened at the lower end by a strong hinge. The combs are put into a kettle of boiling water, and will melt almost immediately. It is then put into the bag, and taken between the levers in a wash tub, or other large vessel and pressed. The contents of the bag shaken and turned several times during the process, and if need be returned to the boiling water and squeezed again. The wax with little water is now to be remelted and strained again through finer cloth into vessels that will mold it into the desired shape. As the sediment settles to the bottom of the wax when melted, a portion may be dipped off nearly pure without straining. Wax in cool weather may be whitened in a short time in the sun, but it must be in very thin flakes. It is readily obtained in this shape by having a very thin board or shingle, which should be first thoroughly wet and then dipped into pure melted wax. Enough will adhere to make it the desired thickness, and will cool instantly on being withdrawn. Draw a knife along the edges and it will readily cleave off. Exposed to the sun in a window or on the snow, it will become perfectly white, when it can be made into cakes for market, where it commands a much higher price than the yellow. It is said that there is a chemical process that whitens it readily, but I am not acquainted with it. End of chapter 24.
Section 49 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jarom Masters. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 25, Purchasing Stocks and Transporting Bees, Part 1. Purchasing Stocks and Transporting Bees. If the reader has no bees and yet has had interest or patience to follow me thus far, it is presumptive evidence that he would possess the requisite perseverance to take charge of them. It would be well, however, to remember the anxieties, perplexities, and time necessary to take the proper care, as well as the advantages and profit. But if you're disposed to try the experiment, very likely some directions for a commencement would be acceptable. Why the word luck is applied to bees. There has been so much uncertainty in stock of this kind that the word luck has been made to express too much. Some have been successful while others have failed entirely. This has suggested the idea that luck depended on the manner that the stocks were obtained, and here again there seems to be a variety of opinions, as is the case always when a thing is guessed at. One will assert that the fickle dame is charmed into favour by stealing a stock or two to begin with, and returning them after a start. Another, a little more conscientious perhaps, that you must take them without liberty, to be sure, but leave an equivalent in money on the stand. Another, that the only way to get up an effectual charm is to exchange sheep for them, and still another says that bees must always be a gift. I have had all these methods offered me gratis, with gravity, suitable to make an impression. And finally there has yet another method been found out, and that is, when you want a few stocks of bees, go and buy them, yes, and pay for them too, in dollars and cents, or take them for a share of the increase for a time, if it suits your pecuniary resources best. And you need not depend on any charm or mystic power for your success. If you do, I cannot avoid the unfavorable prediction of a failure. It is true that a few have accidentally prospered for a few years. I say accidentally because, when they have no true principles of management, it must be the result of accident. It is a saying with some that one man can't have luck but a few years at once, and others none at all, although he tries the whole routine of charms. Nearly 20 years ago, when my respected neighbor predicted a turn in my luck because it was always so, I could not understand the force of this reasoning, unless it belonged to the nature of bees to deteriorate and consequently run out. I at once determined to ascertain this point. I could understand how a farmer would often fail to raise a crop if he depended on chance or luck for success instead of fixed natural principles. It was possible that bees might be similar. I found that in good seasons the majority of people had luck, but in poor seasons the reverse, and when 2 or 3 occurred in succession, then was the time to lose their luck. It was evident then, if I could pass in safety the poor seasons by any means, I should do well enough in the good ones. The result has given me but little reason to complain. My advice, therefore, is that reliance should be placed on proper management instead of luck arising from the manner the first stock was obtained. Should anyone feel disposed to make you a present of a stalk or 2 of bees, I would advise you to accept the offer and be thankful, discarding all apprehension of failure on that account. Or, if anyone is willing, you should take some on shares. This is a cheap way to get a start, and you have no risk of loss in the old stock. Yet, if bees prosper, the interest on the money that stocks cost is a mere trifle in comparison to the value of increase, and you have the same trouble. On the other hand, the owner of bees can afford to take care of a few hives more for half the profits which he has to give if another takes them. This is apt to be the case, especially with such as have no faith in charms. Rule in taking bees for a share. The rule generally adopted for taking bees is this. 1 or more stalks are taken for a term of years, the person taking them finding hives, boxes, and bestowing whatsoever care is necessary, and returning the old stalks to the owner with half the increase in profits. A man may sell his luck. There are yet a few persons who refuse to sell a stock of bees because it is bad luck. There is often some grounds for this notion. It might arise under the following circumstances. Suppose a person has half a dozen hives, 3 extra good, the others of the opposite extreme. He sells for the sake of the better price his 3 best. There is but little doubt that his best luck would go too. But should his poorest be taken, the result would be different, without doubt. But there are cases where an Apiarian has more stocks than he wishes to keep. It has been the case with myself frequently. Persons wishing to sell are the proper ones of which to buy. Purchasers seldom want any but first-rate stocks. They are generally cheapest in the end. There is usually a difference of about $1 in the spring and fall prices, and $5 and $6 are common charges. I have known them to sell at auction at 8, but in some sections they are less. First-rate stocks recommended to begin with. For a beginning, then, I would recommend purchasing none but first-rate stocks. It will make but little difference in the risk whether you obtain them in the spring or fall, if you have read my remarks on winter management with attention. I have already said the requisites for a good stock for winter were a numerous family and plenty of honey, and that the cluster of bees should extend through nearly all the combs, etc. To avoid as far as possible diseased brood, find an apiary where it has never made its appearance to make purchases. There are some who have lost bees by it, and yet are totally ignorant of the cause. It would be well, therefore, to inquire if any stocks have been lost, and then for the cause. Be careful that secondary are not mistaken for primary causes. Old stocks are good as any, if healthy. When it appears that all are exempt by a thorough examination, if not satisfied without, you need not object to stocks 2 or 3 years old. They are just as good as any, sometimes better, providing they have swarmed the season previous, according to one author, because such always have young queens which are more prolific than old ones, that will be in all first swarms. Old stocks are as prosperous as any, as long as they are healthy, yet they are more liable to become diseased. Caution respecting diseased brood. When no apiary from which to purchase can be found, but where the disease has made its appearance, and you are necessitated to purchase from such, or not at all, you cannot be too cautious about it. It would be safest in this case to take none but young swarms, as it is not so common for them to be affected in the first season, yet they are not always exempt. But here, again, you may not be allowed to take all young stocks, in which case, let the weather be pretty cold, the bees will be further up among the combs and give a chance to inspect the combs. At this season, say not earlier than November, all the healthy brood will be hatched. Sometimes a few young bees may be left that have their mature shape and probably have been chilled by sudden cold weather. These are not the result of disease, the bees will remove them the next season, and no bad results follow. In warm weather, a satisfactory inspection can be had no other way but by the use of tobacco smoke. Be particular to reject all that are affected with the disease in the least. Better do without than take such to begin with. A full description has been given of this disease in another place. Result of ignorance in purchasing. A neighbor purchased 13 stock hives. 6 were old ones, the others swarms of the last season. As the old hives were heavy, he of course thought them good. Either he knew nothing of the disease, or took no trouble to examine. 5 of the 6 old ones were badly affected. 4 were lost outright, except the honey. The 5th lasted through the winter, and then had to be transferred. He had flattered himself that they were obtained very cheaply, but when he made out what his good ones cost, he found no great reason in this respect for congratulation. End of section 49.
Section 50 of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby. Chapter 25. Purchasing Stocks and Transporting Bees. Part 2. How large hives can be made smaller. A short time after, I attended, on a cold day, with a sharp saw, square, etc. I found his hives 14 inches square inside and 18 deep, holding about 3,500 inches. Of this square, a little more than 10 inches in height would make just the right size. To work convenient, I inverted the hive on a barrel, set on the end, marked the length, and sawed it off, without a bee leaving. It was very cold, mercury at 6 degrees. The bees came to the edges of the combs, but the cold drove them back. In a short time I had taken off 6. 4, when done, were just about full. The other 2 were so when I began, but they were marked and sawed like the rest. When the combs were attached, they were severed with a knife, and the piece of the hive thus loose was raised off, leaving several inches of the combs projecting out of the hive. I now cut off the first comb, even with the bottom of the hive. On the next comb there were a few bees. With a quill these were brushed down into the hive. This piece was then removed, and the bees on the other side of it were brushed down also. In this way, all others were removed and left the hive just full. The other full hive, after it was sawed on each side, a small wire was drawn through parallel with the sheets and severed all the combs at once. Each piece was taken out, and the bees that were clustered on them brushed back. Removing the loose part of the hive was the last thing to be done. This last method was preferred to the other by my employer, yet it was all performed to his satisfaction. No sting or other difficulty about it, except for the trouble of warming fingers rather frequently. Tobacco smoke would have kept them quiet during the operation, nearly as well. If preferred, a hive may stand right side up while sawing it. Moderate weather best to remove bees. In transporting your bees, avoid if possible the 2 extremes of very cold or very warm weather. In the latter, the combs are so nearly melted that the weight of the honey will bend them, bursting the cells, spilling the honey, and besmearing the bees. In very cold weather, the combs are brittle and easily detached from the sides of the hives. When necessitated to move them in very cold weather, they should be put up an hour or so before starting. The agitation of the bees after being disturbed will create considerable heat. A portion of this will be imparted to the combs and add to their strength. Preparations for transporting bees. To prepare for moving them, pieces of thin muslin about half a yard square as good as anything, secured by carpet tacks. Securing bees in the hive. The hive is inverted and the cloth put over, neatly folded, and fastened with a tack at the corners, and another in the middle. The tack is crowed in about 2/3 of its length. It then presents the head convenient to pull out. If the bees are to go a great distance and require to be shut up several days, the muslin will be hardly sufficient, as they would probably bite their way out. Something more substantial would then be required. Take a board the size of the bottom, cut out a place in the middle, and cover with wire cloth, like the one recommended for hiving, and fasten it with tacks. This board is to be nailed on the hive. After the nails are driven with the hammer, start it off about the 1/8 of an inch. It will admit a little air around the sides as well as the middle, quite necessary for heavy stalks. But very small families might be safe without the wire cloth. Air enough would pass between the hive and the board, except in warm weather. New combs break easier than old. Best conveyance. Probably the best conveyance is a wagon with elliptical strings, but a wagon without springs is bad, especially for young stalks. Yet I have known them move safely in this way, but it required some care in packing with hay or straw under and around them, and careful driving. Good sleighing will answer very well, and by some thought to be the best time. Hive to be inverted. Whatever conveyance is employed, the hive should be inverted. The combs will then rest all closely on the top and are less liable to break than when right end up, because then the whole weight of the combs must depend upon the fastenings at the top and sides for support, and are easily detached and fall. When moving bees so reversed, they will creep upward, and stalks part full, they will often nearly all leave the combs, and get upon the covering. In a short time after being set up, they will return, except in very cold weather, when a few will sometimes freeze. Consequently, a warm room is required to put them in for a short time. After carrying them a few miles, the disposition to sting is generally gone, yet there are a few exceptions. In moderate weather, when bees are confined, they manifest a persevering determination to find their way out, particularly after being moved and somewhat disturbed. I have known them to bite holes through muslin in 3 days. The same difficulty is often attendant on attempting to confine them to the hive by muslin when in the house in the winter, except when kept in a cold situation. Should any combs become broken or detached from their fastenings and hives not full, by moving or other accident, rendering them liable to fall when set up, the hive may remain inverted on the stand till warm weather, if necessary, and the bees have again fastened them, which they do soon after commencing work in the spring. If they are so badly broken that they bend over, rolls of paper may be put between them to preserve the proper distance till secured. When they commence making new combs, or before, it is time to turn the right end up. While the hive is inverted, it is essential that a hole is in the side, through which the bees may work. A board should fit close over the bottom and covered to effectually prevent any water from getting among the bees, etc. Conclusion. In conclusion, I would say that the apiarian who has followed me attentively and has added nothing of value to his stock of information possesses an enviable experience that all should strive to obtain. It has been said that 3 out of 5 who commence an apiary must fail, but let us suppose it is through ignorance or inattention, and not inherent with the bees. To the beginner, then, I would say, if you expect to succeed in obtaining one of the most delectable of sweets for your own consumption, or the profit in dollars and cents, you will find something more requisite than merely holding the dish to obtain the porridge. See your bees often, and know at all times their actual condition. This one recipe is worth more than all others that can be given. It is at the head of the class of duties. All others begin here. Even the grand secret of successfully combating the worms, keep your bees strong, must take its rise at this point. With the above motto acted upon, carried out fully, and with perseverance, you cannot well fail to realize all reasonable expectations. Avoid over-anxiety for a rapid increase in stocks. Try to be satisfied with one good swarm from stock annually. Your chances are better than with more. Do not anticipate the golden harvest too soon. You will probably be necessitated to discard some of the extravagant reports of profits from the apiary. Yet you will find one stock trebling, perhaps quadrupling its price or value in products, while the one beside it does nothing. In some seasons particularly favorable, your stocks collectively will yield a return of 100 or 200%, and others hardly make a return for trouble. The proper estimate can be made only after a number of years, when, if they have been judiciously managed and your ideas have not been too extravagant, you will be fully satisfied. I have known a single stock in one season to produce more than $20 in swarms and honey, and 90 stocks to produce over $900, when a few of the number added not a farthing to the amount. I do not wish to hold out inducements for anyone to commence beekeeping and end it in disgust and disappointment, but I will encourage all suitable persons to try their skill in bee management. I say suitable persons because there are many, very many, not qualified for the charge. The careless, inattentive man who leaves his bees unnoticed from October till May will be likely to complain of ill success. Whoever cannot find time to give his bees the needed care, but can spend an hour each day obtaining gossip at the neighborhood tavern, is unfit for this business. But he who has borne a home and finds his affections beginning to be divided between that and his companions of the barroom, and wishes to withdraw his interest from unprofitable associates, and yet has nothing of sufficient power to break the bond, to what he can apply a better prospect of success than to engage in keeping bees. They make ample returns for each little care. Pecuniary advantages are not all that may be gained. A great many points concerning their natural history are yet in the dark, and many are disputed. Would it not be a source of satisfaction to be able to contribute a few more facts to this interesting subject, adding to the science and holding a share in the general fund? Supposing all the mysteries pertaining to their economy discovered and elucidated, precluding all chance of further additions, would the study be dry and monotonous? On the contrary, the verification witnessed by ourselves would be so fascinating and instructive that we cannot avoid pitying the condition of the man who finds gratification only in the gross and sensual. It has been remarked that, quote, he who cannot find in this and other branches of natural history a salutary exercise for his mental faculties, inducing a habit of observation and reflection, a pleasure so easily obtained unalloyed by any despacing mixture, tending to expand and harmonize his mind, and elevate it to the conceptions of the majestic, sublime, serene, and beautiful arrangements instituted by God of nature, must possess an organization sadly deficient, or be surrounded by circumstances indeed lamentable. End quote. I would recommend the study of the honeybee as one best calculated to awaken the interest of the indifferent. What can attest the attention like their structure? Their diligence in collecting stores for the future, their secretion of wax and molding it into structures with mathematical precision astonishing the profoundest philosophers, their maternal and fraternal affection in regarding the mother's every want, and assiduous care in nursing her offspring to maturity, their unaccountable display of instinct in emergencies or accidents, filling the beholder with wonder and amazement. The mind thus contemplating such astonishing operations cannot well avoid looking beyond these results to their divine author. Therefore, let every mind that perceives one ray of light from nature's mysterious transactions, and is capable of receiving the least enjoyment therefrom, pursue the path still inviting onward in the pursuit. Every new acquisition will bring an additional satisfaction, and assist in the next attempt, which will be commenced with a renewed and constantly increasing zest, and will arise from the contemplation a wiser, better, and nobler being, far superior to those who have never soared beyond the gratifications of the mere animal groveling in the dark. Is there, in the whole circle of nature's exhaustless storehouse, any one science more inviting than this? What more exalting and refining, and at the same time making a return in profits as a pecuniary reward? What would be the result in the aggregate of all the honey produced in the flowers of the United States annually? Suppose we estimate the productions of 1 acre to be 1 pound of honey, which is but a small part of the real product in most places. Yet, as a great many acres are covered with water and forest. Footnote, it should not be forgotten that forest trees are valuable, especially when there is basswood or even maple. End footnote. This estimate is probably enough for the average. This state, New York, contains 47,000 square miles. 640 acres in a square mile will multiply into a little more than 30 million. And each acre producing its pound of honey, we have the grand result of 30 million pounds of honey. If we add the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, we have an amount of over 126 million pounds. What it might be by including all the states, those disposed may ascertain. Enough for our purpose is made clear, and that is, a small item only of an enormous amount is now secured. End of Section 50. Read by Gray Pickett, June 27th, 2022. End of Mysteries of Beekeeping Explained by Moses Quinby.